The official records of the Imperium state that Alpharius Omegon was the last Primarch to be reunited with the Emperor, discovered in the later stages of the Great Crusade, when most of his brothers had already taken command of their respective legions. This narrative, endorsed by the Administratum and repeated across countless imperial documents, places his discovery sometime after the majority of the Great Crusade's early conquests had been completed. Yet even within the Imperium's own archives, contradictions emerge. Scattered references, fragmentary reports from remembrancers, and the testimonies of certain Astartes who served in those early years suggest a radically different timeline. Some accounts claim that Alpharius was not the last Primarch found, but potentially the first, and that he had been operating within the Imperium's shadow infrastructure for years, perhaps decades, before his official presentation to the wider Imperium. The circumstances of Alpharius's emergence remain deliberately obscured, wrapped in layers of misdirection that may well have been constructed by the Primarch himself. Unlike the dramatic discoveries of his brothers, Leman Russ found among the wolves of Fenris, Sanguinius discovered on the irradiated wastes of Baal, or Gilliman raised in the civilized society of Macragge, no clear narrative exists for Alpharius's reunion with the Emperor. The most widely circulated account describes the Emperor encountering Alpharius in the outer reaches of the Sol system itself, already commanding a small fleet and demonstrating a mastery of void warfare that suggested years of experience. This version claims that Alpharius had somehow managed to remain undetected in humanity's home system, building resources and gathering intelligence while his father prosecuted the Great Crusade across the galaxy. Other sources paint an even more unsettling picture. These accounts suggest that Alpharius made contact with the Emperor far earlier, possibly within years of the Primarchs, scattering from the Emperor's gene laboratories on Terra. According to this version of events, the Emperor recognized the unique potential of this particular son and made the strategic decision to keep his existence hidden. Rather than announcing the discovery and placing Alpharius at the head of his legion immediately, the Emperor allegedly deployed him as a covert asset, allowing the Primarch to infiltrate and observe the growing Imperium from within. Proponents of this theory point to unexplained strategic victories during the Unification Wars and early Great Crusade, suggesting that an unseen hand guided certain operations with preternatural precision. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes, or it may be something else entirely. What remains certain is that by the time Alpharius officially took command of the 20th Legion, he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of imperial military doctrine, intimate familiarity with the strengths and weaknesses of his brother Primarchs, and a network of contacts that seemed impossible for someone only recently discovered. Whether this knowledge came from years of covert observation or from some other source remains one of the Alpha Legion's many secrets. Before their Primarch's arrival, the 20th Legion had already established itself as a capable fighting force, though one that operated differently from its brother legions. Recruited primarily from Terra during the later stages of the Unification Wars, the Legion drew its initial candidates from a variety of sources. Unlike legions such as the 1st or 16th, which had clear cultural identities from their inception, the 20th Legion seemed to deliberately avoid developing a singular character. Its recruits came from the Hive cities, from the techno-barbarian remnants absorbed into the Imperium, from the gene cults of the Urals, and from populations across Terra that had no particular connection to one another. This diverse recruitment base created a legion without a unified cultural identity, which some observers initially interpreted as a weakness. The 20th Legion's Astartes did not share the brotherhood bonds forged through common heritage that characterized many of their fellow legions. They did not hail from a single warrior culture or share ancestral traditions. Instead, they developed something else, an adaptability that would become their defining characteristic. Without the weight of tradition dictating their approach to warfare, the 20th Legion's warriors proved remarkably flexible in their tactical thinking. During the early campaigns of the Great Crusade, before Alpharius's official discovery, the 20th Legion operated primarily in a support capacity. They were frequently attached to other legions' expeditionary fleets, rarely fighting as a unified force under their own command. This operational pattern allowed them to observe and learn from multiple combat doctrines. They fought alongside the methodical, overwhelming assaults of the Imperial Fists, studied the rapid strike tactics of the White Scars, and witnessed the brutal efficiency of the World Eaters before that legion's descent into madness. Each deployment added to their collective knowledge, and the 20th Legion proved adept at incorporating elements from various approaches into their own developing doctrine. The Legion also demonstrated an unusual emphasis on intelligence gathering and operational security from its earliest days. While all Space Marine legions maintained reconnaissance elements and valued battlefield intelligence, the 20th Legion elevated these activities to a central component of their operations. They deployed extensive spy networks on worlds before invasions commenced, infiltrated enemy command structures, and frequently achieved victory through information superiority rather than martial prowess alone. Their victories were often attributed to other legions or to army forces, and the 20th Legion seemed content to operate without glory or recognition. When Alpharius finally assumed command, he found a legion that was uniquely suited to his particular vision of warfare. Rather than imposing a new doctrine on reluctant warriors, he refined and expanded practices that the Legion had already begun developing. Under his guidance, the emphasis on intelligence operations intensified. The Legion's organizational structure underwent radical changes, with traditional company and chapter designations becoming increasingly fluid. Alpharius implemented a system where any legionary could assume command if circumstances required it, where squad compositions changed based on mission requirements, and where the traditional hierarchies that governed other legions became secondary to operational effectiveness. The revelation of Omegon's existence added another layer of complexity to an already mysterious legion. Unlike the other Primarchs, who each commanded their own legion, Alpharius and Omegon shared control of the 20th Legion, creating a unique dual-headed leadership structure. The exact circumstances of Omegon's emergence remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he was discovered separately from Alpharius, possibly on a different world entirely. Others claim that Omegon had been with Alpharius from the beginning, and that the two had deliberately concealed this fact from the Emperor and their brothers until the time was right to reveal it. What made this arrangement particularly unusual was the apparent interchangeability of the twin Primarchs. They were not merely brothers who looked alike, they were virtually indistinguishable in appearance, voice, and manner. Both stood shorter than most of their brother Primarchs, lacking the imposing physical presence of warriors like Vulcan or Ferrus Manus. This relatively modest stature, combined with their identical appearance, allowed them to perform one of their most effective deceptions, switching places without anyone noticing. A legionary who believed he was speaking with Alpharius might actually be addressing Omegon, and vice versa. This practice extended beyond simple confusion. It represented a fundamental challenge to the concept of singular leadership that defined the other legions. The twin Primarchs used this interchangeability to maximum strategic advantage. They could appear in two places simultaneously, attend different war councils, and present contradictory information to different audiences while maintaining the fiction that only one Primarch commanded the Legion. This ability to be in multiple places at once gave the Alpha Legion a flexibility in command that no other legion could match. More importantly, it introduced an element of uncertainty into every interaction with the Legion's leadership. No one outside the Legion could ever be entirely certain which Primarch they were dealing with, or whether the Primarch they had spoken to yesterday was the same individual they were addressing today. The existence of Omegon also raised profound questions about the nature of the Primarchs themselves. The Emperor had created 20 Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of chaos. Yet here were two individuals who shared a single Legion number, who were apparently both products of the same creation process. Were they truly twins, two separate beings created simultaneously? Or were they something else, perhaps two halves of a single whole, divided in ways that went beyond simple physical separation? The Alpha Legion offered no answers to these questions, and the twins themselves seemed to delight in the speculation their existence provoked. The physical characteristics of Alpharius and Omegon set them apart from their brother Primarchs in ways that proved tactically advantageous rather than limiting. Where Vulcan towered over even his Gene sons, and where Mortarian's gaunt frame commanded immediate recognition, the twin Primarchs stood at a height that barely exceeded that of their Astartes warriors. Accounts from those who encountered them describe Primarchs who could stand in a formation of legionaries without immediately drawing attention through sheer physical presence. This relative lack of stature, though they still possessed the enhanced physiology and capabilities of all Primarchs, became one of their most valuable assets. They could move among their sons without the visual distinction that marked other Primarchs, allowing them to observe, command, and operate with a degree of anonymity impossible for their brothers. Their facial features shared the same classical proportions common to all Primarchs, but without the distinctive characteristics that made their brothers immediately identifiable. Alpharius and Omegon possessed no facial scars like those that marked Ferrus Manus, no unusual skin tone like Vulcan's coal-black complexion, no wings like Sanguinius. Their features were handsome but unremarkable within the context of Primarch physiology, strong jawlines, symmetrical faces, and piercing eyes that could belong to any of the Emperor's sons if viewed without context. This apparent ordinariness was, of course, anything but ordinary. It represented a different kind of genetic optimization, one focused on adaptability and concealment rather than immediate recognition and command presence. The twins' ability to perfectly mimic each other extended beyond simple physical similarity. Their voices carried the same timbre and inflection. Their mannerisms mirrored one another with such precision that even extended observation failed to reveal distinguishing patterns. They moved with identical grace, fought with the same techniques, and even their thought patterns seemed to align in ways that suggested something deeper than mere similarity. Legionaries who served under both Primarchs reported an unsettling sensation when interacting with them, a feeling that they were speaking to the same individual regardless of which twin stood before them. This went beyond trained mimicry. It suggested a fundamental connection that operated at a level other Primarchs did not share with their brothers. The nature of this connection became a subject of intense speculation among those few outside the Legion who knew of Omegon's existence. Some theorized a psychic bond similar to, but more profound than the general connection all Primarchs shared through their father's genetic legacy. Others suggested that the twins represented a unique experiment in the Emperor's Primarch project, perhaps an attempt to create a redundant command structure, or to explore the possibilities of distributed consciousness across multiple bodies. The twins themselves never clarified the nature of their bond, but operational records from the Great Crusade provide compelling evidence of coordination that exceeded normal communication methods. Battle reports from campaigns where the twins operated separately described decision-making that suggested real-time information sharing. Alpharius would adjust his approach to a siege based on intelligence that Omegon had gathered parsecs away, often before any conventional communication could have reached him. Omegon would modify fleet dispositions to account for enemy movements that Alpharius had observed on a planetary surface, with timing that suggested instantaneous awareness rather than delayed reporting. This apparent shared consciousness, or whatever mechanism actually connected them, gave the Alpha Legion a command structure that could respond to developing situations with unprecedented speed and coordination. The strategic advantages of this dual command system became evident in how the twins deployed the Legion's resources. Traditional Space Marine Legion doctrine concentrated forces under a single command authority, with the Primarch directing operations from a central location. The Alpha Legion operated differently. Alpharius might command one expeditionary fleet while Omegon led another, allowing the Legion to prosecute multiple campaigns simultaneously while maintaining unified strategic direction. This distribution of command authority meant that the Legion could engage in operations across vast distances without the coordination problems that plagued other divided forces. The twins thought as one, planned as one, and executed strategies that treated the galaxy as a single operational theater rather than a collection of separate battlefields. The practice of identity assumption that characterized the Alpha Legion began with the Primarchs themselves. Both Alpharius and Omegon actively encouraged their legionaries to claim the Alpharius identity, creating a deliberate confusion about who actually commanded at any given moment. This practice served multiple purposes beyond simple operational security. It created a culture where individual glory became subordinate to collective success, where the mission mattered more than personal recognition. A legionary who successfully completed an operation while claiming to be Alpharius contributed to the mystique of the Primarch rather than building his own reputation. This stood in stark contrast to legions like the Emperor's Children or the World Eaters, where individual warriors competed for recognition and glory. The philosophical implications of this identity fluidity went deeper than tactical deception. By encouraging their sons to assume their identity, the twins challenged fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and command that structured the other legions. In the Ultramarines, Roboute Guilliman stood as the unquestioned apex of command, with clear chains of authority descending from him through chapter masters and company captains. In the Alpha Legion, any legionary might speak with the authority of Alpharius. Any officer might make decisions that traditionally belonged to the Primarch alone. This created an organization where the removal of any single individual, including the Primarchs themselves, would not significantly degrade operational capability. The Legion became greater than any of its parts, including its founders. This approach to identity and command created operational security advantages that proved nearly impossible to counter. Enemy forces attempting to assassinate the Alpha Legion's leadership found themselves facing an impossible problem. How do you kill a commander who might be any one of thousands of warriors? Intelligence agencies trying to track Alpharius's movements discovered that he appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, that confirmed sightings contradicted each other, and that the very concept of tracking an individual became meaningless when that individual's identity was shared across an entire legion. The twins had created a command structure that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that could survive the loss of any component because no single component was essential. The relationship between Alpharius Omegon and their brother Primarchs proved complex and often contradictory. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, took a particular interest in the twins and their legion. He recognized the value of their unconventional approach to warfare and incorporated the Alpha Legion into operations where their skills in infiltration and intelligence gathering provided crucial advantages. Horus served as something of a mentor to the twins, though the exact nature of their relationship remains obscured by the later events of the Horus Heresy. The War Master appreciated the Alpha Legion's ability to achieve objectives through misdirection and covert action, seeing them as a valuable tool for operations that required subtlety rather than overwhelming force. This mentorship relationship with Horus stood in stark contrast to the twins' interactions with Roboute Guilliman. The Primarch of the Ultramarines represented everything the Alpha Legion was not open, organized according to clear hierarchies, and committed to standardized doctrines that could be replicated across the entire Imperium. Guilliman's Codex Astartes, which he developed during the later stages of the Great Crusade, embodied principles that fundamentally opposed the Alpha Legion's operational philosophy. Where Guilliman sought to create universal standards that any commander could implement, the Alpha Legion embraced flexibility and adaptation. Where Guilliman believed in clear chains of command and defined responsibilities, the Alpha Legion practiced fluid authority and shared identity. The philosophical differences between Guilliman and the twins manifested in practical disagreements about military doctrine. Guilliman viewed the Alpha Legion's methods with suspicion, seeing their emphasis on covert operations and deception as potentially undermining the straightforward approach he believed the Imperium required. The twins, for their part, likely viewed Guilliman's systematic approach as inflexible and vulnerable to enemies who understood his predictable patterns. These differences never escalated into open conflict during the Great Crusade, but they created a tension that colored interactions between the two legions. Joint operations between the Ultramarines and Alpha Legion were rare, and when they did occur, they often revealed the fundamental incompatibility of their approaches. other Primarchs reacted to the twins with varying degrees of acceptance and suspicion. Rogel Dorn, whose imperial fists epitomized straightforward siege warfare and direct confrontation, found little common ground with the Alpha Legion's methods. Dorn valued honor and transparency in warfare, concepts that seemed antithetical to the twins' embrace of deception and misdirection. Conversely, Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard shared some tactical similarities with the Alpha Legion, as both legions employed stealth and surprise as primary weapons. However, even Corax maintained a clearer distinction between his own identity and that of his warriors, never encouraging the kind of identity fluidity that characterized the Alpha Legion. The twins' stature and their practice of moving among their legionaries without clear identification created situations that would have been impossible for other Primarchs. Reports exist of Alpha Legion operations where enemy forces believed they had killed Alpharius, only to discover that the warrior they had slain was a legionary wearing his Primarch's armor and bearing his weapons. These instances of deliberate sacrifice, legionaries dying while claiming their Primarch's identity, demonstrated the depth of commitment the twins had instilled in their sons. It also raised disturbing questions about how many times Alpharius or Omegon might have actually died, with the surviving twin simply continuing to use both identities without acknowledging the loss. The twins exploited their interchangeability in diplomatic contexts as effectively as in military operations. They could present contradictory positions to different imperial officials while maintaining the fiction of a single consistent policy. Alpharius might promise support to one expedition fleet, while Omegon committed those same resources elsewhere, creating confusion that served the Legion's interests. They could attend multiple war councils simultaneously, gathering intelligence from different sources while preventing any single authority from gaining a complete picture of the Alpha Legion's capabilities or intentions. This diplomatic flexibility gave them influence disproportionate to their Legion's size, as they could negotiate from multiple positions simultaneously. The psychological impact of the twins' approach to identity extended beyond their Legion. Other Primarchs, accustomed to being unique and irreplaceable, found the concept of shared identity fundamentally unsettling. Each Primarch understood themselves as singular. There was one Leman Russ, one Lionel Johnson, one Fulgrim. The existence of two Alpharius Omegons challenged this understanding of what it meant to be a Primarch. It suggested that individuality, which the other Primarchs took as fundamental to their nature, might be less essential than they believed. This philosophical challenge may have contributed to the distance other Primarchs maintained from the twins, as if prolonged exposure to their fluid approach to identity might somehow contaminate the certainty with which other Primarchs understood themselves. The organizational structure of the Alpha Legion represented a radical departure from the standardized formations that characterized most Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade, where Guilliman's Ultramarines operated according to precisely defined chapters, companies, and squads with clear numerical designations and command hierarchies. The Alpha Legion embraced a cellular structure that prioritized operational flexibility over administrative clarity. Individual cells operated with significant autonomy, receiving broad strategic objectives rather than detailed tactical instructions. These cells might consist of a single squad, a company-sized formation, or even larger groupings depending on mission requirements, and their composition changed frequently based on operational needs rather than remaining fixed according to organizational charts. This cellular approach meant that traditional Legion organization became almost meaningless when applied to the Alpha Legion. A captain might command different warriors from one operation to the next, with legionaries reassigned based on their specific skills rather than their permanent unit affiliation. A veteran sergeant could find himself leading a kill team of specialists he had never worked with before, trusting in shared training and doctrine rather than long-established personal bonds. This constant reorganization prevented the formation of the tight-knit company identities that defined units in other legions, where warriors fought alongside the same brothers for decades and developed deep loyalties to their specific formations. In the Alpha Legion, loyalty focused on the mission and the Legion as a whole rather than on particular units or commanders. The autonomy granted to these cells extended to strategic decision-making in ways that would have horrified more traditionally minded Primarchs. An Alpha Legion cell operating deep behind enemy lines might receive an objective such as destabilizing a planetary government or eliminating a specific military capability, but the methods for achieving that objective remained entirely at the cell's discretion. The cell commander could choose to assassinate key officials, foment rebellion among the population, sabotage critical infrastructure, or employ any combination of approaches that circumstances suggested. This freedom to adapt tactics to local conditions made Alpha Legion operations notoriously difficult to predict or counter, as enemy forces could never be certain what form an attack might take. Communication between cells operated on a strict need-to-know basis, with compartmentalization ensuring that the compromise of one cell would not endanger others. A cell conducting reconnaissance on a target world might have no knowledge of other Alpha Legion operations occurring simultaneously in the same system. Legionaries captured and interrogated could reveal only the specific details of their own mission, unable to compromise the broader operational picture because they simply did not possess that information. This compartmentalization extended even to knowledge of the Legion's overall strength and disposition. Individual cells knew their own objectives and had limited awareness of nearby friendly forces, but the complete picture of Alpha Legion deployments remained known only to the Primarchs and perhaps a handful of senior commanders. The practice of multiple legionaries adopting the Alpharius identity extended throughout the command structure, creating deliberate confusion about who actually held authority at any given moment. During operations, any legionary might claim to be Alpharius when communicating with enemy forces, allied Imperial units, or even other Alpha Legion cells. This practice served multiple purposes beyond simple deception. It protected the actual Primarchs by ensuring that enemy assassination attempts might target any one of thousands of warriors claiming that identity. It also created a psychological effect on both enemies and allies, as the apparent omnipresence of Alpharius suggested resources and capabilities far beyond the Legion's actual strength. Within the Legion itself, this identity fluidity reinforced the principle that individual identity mattered less than collective success. A legionary who successfully infiltrated an enemy command structure while claiming to be Alpharius contributed to the mystique and reputation of the Primarch, rather than building personal glory. When that same legionary later operated under his own identity or assumed a different cover identity entirely, the success still benefited the Legion, while preventing enemy intelligence services from building accurate profiles of individual operators. This approach created a Legion where enemy forces could never be certain whether they faced a single squad or the full might of the Primarch himself, as any Alpha Legion warrior might credibly claim supreme authority. The specialized formations within the Alpha Legion represented refinements of this cellular structure rather than exceptions to it. The Efrit stealth squads embodied the Legion's emphasis on covert operations and infiltration. These units specialized in operating behind enemy lines for extended periods, often spending months or even years embedded within target populations before striking. Efrit operatives wore modified power armor incorporating sophisticated chameleon technology and void shielding that rendered them nearly invisible to both visual observation and auspex scanning. They carried specialized weaponry designed for silent elimination of targets, including needle rifles loaded with toxins calibrated to specific Xenos physiologies and mono-edged blades that could kill without sound. Efrit squads operated with even greater autonomy than standard Alpha Legion cells, often deployed with objectives that might not be activated for years after insertion. An Efrit team might establish themselves within a planetary government, building cover identities and integrating into local society while awaiting orders that would eventually trigger their mission. This patient approach to warfare stood in stark contrast to the rapid assaults favored by legions like the White Scars or the shock tactics employed by the World Eaters. Effort operatives understood that their mission might require years of preparation before a single shot was fired, and they accepted this extended deployment as the price of operational success. The Headhunter kill teams represented a more direct application of the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare. These formations specialized in the identification and elimination of enemy command structures, targeting officers, political leaders, and other high-value individuals whose removal would create maximum disruption. Headhunter operatives trained extensively in intelligence analysis, learning to identify key nodes in enemy organizations and predict the consequences of removing specific individuals. They studied enemy military doctrine, political structures, and cultural practices to understand how different societies would respond to leadership decapitation. This analytical approach meant that Headhunter strikes aimed not just to kill enemy leaders, but to create specific cascading effects within enemy organizations. Headhunter kill teams employed a diverse arsenal of specialized assassination weapons. Banestrike bolter rounds incorporated rare materials that enhanced their armor penetration capabilities, allowing them to defeat the protective equipment typically worn by high-value targets. Combined weapons integrated multiple firing modes, giving Headhunter operatives the flexibility to engage targets at various ranges and under different tactical circumstances. Some teams employed exotic xenotech weapons acquired during the Great Crusade, devices whose operation the Mechanicum barely understood, but which proved devastatingly effective against specific target types. The Alpha Legion's willingness to use such non-standard equipment marked another departure from the practices of more conservative legions, which maintained strict adherence to approved weapon patterns. The Lernean Terminators formed the Alpha Legion's elite shock assault force, though even these heavily armored warriors operated according to principles that differentiated them from Terminator formations in other legions. Named for the Lernean Hydra of ancient Terran mythology, these veterans wore tactical dreadnought armor modified with additional sensor systems and communications equipment that allowed them to coordinate complex multi-vector assaults. Unlike the Terminator formations of the Imperial Fists or Dark Angels, which typically deployed as anvils around which battles pivoted, Lernean Terminators functioned as the armored fist at the end of carefully planned operations. They struck at critical moments identified through extensive intelligence preparation, their arrival timed to exploit vulnerabilities that other Alpha Legion elements had created through preparatory operations. Lernean Terminators carried power spears as their signature weapons, a choice that reflected both practical considerations and symbolic meaning. The power spear's reach allowed them to engage enemies before those enemies could bring their own weapons to bear, a crucial advantage when operating in the confined spaces where Terminator armor proved most effective. The spear also served as a symbol of the Lernean Hydra, each warrior representing one of the mythological creature's many heads. The formation's organization reinforced this symbolism, with squads operating in coordinated strikes that mimicked the Hydra's ability to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. When one Lernean fell, another immediately moved to fill the gap, maintaining the formation's integrity through redundancy and adaptability. The integration of human operatives into the Alpha Legion structure represented perhaps the most distinctive aspect of their organization. Other legions certainly employed human auxiliaries, scouts, and intelligence assets, but these forces operated as separate entities supporting the Space Marines rather than as integrated components of the Legion itself. The Alpha Legion blurred this distinction, incorporating human operatives so thoroughly into their operations that the line between Legion and auxiliary became nearly meaningless. Human agents received training from Alpha Legion specialists, operated according to Legion doctrine, and in many cases possessed authority to direct Astartes resources when operational requirements demanded it. These human operatives ranged from highly trained intelligence officers to deep cover agents embedded within target societies years before the Alpha Legion's overt arrival. Some had undergone extensive augmentation, receiving implants and enhancements that pushed them to the limits of baseline human capability. Others maintained completely unmodified physiology, their value lying precisely in their ability to pass as ordinary citizens of whatever society they infiltrated. The Alpha Legion recruited these operatives from diverse sources, selecting individuals who demonstrated particular aptitudes for intelligence work, infiltration, or long-term covert operations. Unlike the recruitment of Astartes, which focused on young candidates with specific genetic compatibility, human operative recruitment considered a much broader range of factors, including existing social connections, language capabilities, and psychological suitability for extended isolation. The network of cultists and agents that the Alpha Legion cultivated across the galaxy created an intelligence apparatus that exceeded the capabilities of any other legion. These networks operated independently of direct Astartes supervision, with human controllers managing chains of informants, sleeper agents, and active operatives. Information flowed through these networks using sophisticated tradecraft that incorporated both technological and human intelligence methods. Dead drops, encoded transmissions, and face-to-face meetings all played roles in moving intelligence from sources to handlers, and eventually to Alpha Legion command elements. The compartmentalization that characterized Alpha Legion's cellular structure extended to these human networks, ensuring that the compromise of individual agents or even entire networks would not expose the broader intelligence infrastructure. The Alpha Legion's human operatives frequently established themselves within Imperial institutions, creating sources of information within the very organizations that might otherwise investigate the Legion's activities. Administratum officials, Imperial Army officers, and even members of other Space Marine Legion support staffs might secretly report to Alpha Legion handlers, providing intelligence about deployments, strategic planning, and internal politics. This penetration of Imperial institutions gave the Alpha Legion awareness of developments that other legions only learned about through official channels, often allowing them to position resources advantageously before their brothers even knew opportunities existed. Cultist organizations provided another layer to the Alpha Legion's extended network. These groups, often established decades before the Legion's overt arrival in a region, prepared target populations for Imperial conquest through subtle influence operations. A cult might promote philosophical ideas that aligned with Imperial values, gradually shifting a society's cultural orientation in ways that would ease eventual integration. Alternatively, cults might deliberately destabilize societies that the Imperium intended to conquer, creating internal conflicts that weakened defensive capabilities. The Alpha Legion's cultists rarely understood their true purpose, believing themselves to be members of religious or philosophical movements rather than instruments of a Space Marine Legion's strategic planning. The logistical challenges of maintaining such an extensive network of human operatives required resources that the Alpha Legion allocated with the same priority as weapons and ammunition. Safe houses on thousands of worlds provided secure locations for meetings and dead drops. Encrypted communication systems allowed operatives to report intelligence without exposing themselves to detection. Financial resources supported operatives cover identities and funded influence operations. The Alpha Legion maintained this infrastructure through a combination of official Legion resources and covert revenue streams that included legitimate business operations, criminal enterprises, and exploitation of bureaucratic inefficiencies within Imperial administrative systems. This integration of human operatives into Legion operations created a force that operated at multiple levels simultaneously. While Astartes warriors conducted direct action missions, human agents prepared the operational environment through intelligence collection and influence operations. While Lernean Terminators struck at hardened targets, cultists created diversions and fed disinformation to enemy forces. The result was a military organization that functioned less like a traditional Space Marine Legion and more like a comprehensive intelligence and special operations force that happened to include Astartes among its capabilities. The Alpha Legion's true strength lay not in the number of Space Marines it could deploy, but in the complete system of intelligence, influence, and direct action that it had constructed across the galaxy. The flexibility inherent in this organizational structure allowed the Alpha Legion to scale operations according to strategic requirements. A single-effort operative could conduct reconnaissance that would inform planning for operations involving thousands of warriors. A headhunter kill team's successful elimination of enemy leadership might enable conventional Imperial Army forces to achieve victory without significant Alpha Legion combat involvement. Conversely, the Legion could concentrate enormous resources on objectives that warranted such investment, drawing on cells from across multiple sectors to assemble task forces tailored to specific operational requirements. This ability to modulate force application based on precise assessment of what each situation required made the Alpha Legion extraordinarily efficient in terms of resource utilization. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare rested on a fundamental principle that distinguished them from every other Space Marine Legion: the belief that victory should be achieved through the systematic dismantling of an enemy's ability to resist rather than through direct confrontation. Where other legions viewed battle as a contest of strength, will, and martial prowess, the Alpha Legion treated warfare as a problem to be solved through the application of intelligence, deception, and precisely calibrated force. This philosophical difference manifested in every aspect of their operations, from strategic planning to individual combat actions, creating a legion that often achieved its objectives before enemies even realized they were under attack. The multi-vector assault methodology formed the cornerstone of Alpha Legion tactical doctrine. This approach rejected the concentrated application of force that characterized most Space Marine operations in favor of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, each designed to overwhelm specific elements of enemy command and control infrastructure. A typical Alpha Legion assault might begin with effort teams sabotaging communications nodes, while headhunter kill teams eliminated key officers, creating confusion about the nature and scale of the attack. As enemy forces attempted to respond to these initial strikes, additional Alpha Legion elements would attack supply depots, command bunkers, and reserve positions, preventing the enemy from organizing an effective defense. The final phase might involve conventional assault forces exploiting the chaos created by these preparatory operations, striking at objectives that had been stripped of effective protection through the systematic degradation of enemy capabilities. This methodology required exceptional coordination and timing, as the various elements of a multi-vector assault needed to strike within narrow windows to achieve maximum effect. The Alpha Legion's cellular structure and compartmentalized communications made such coordination challenging, but the Legion had developed sophisticated methods for synchronizing operations without requiring constant communication between elements. Cells operated according to detailed time schedules established during mission planning, with each element executing its assigned tasks at predetermined moments. This approach reduced the need for real-time coordination while maintaining the synchronization necessary for effective multi-vector operations. If one element failed to achieve its objectives, other cells could adapt their actions based on pre-established contingency plans rather than requiring new orders from higher command. The psychological impact of multi-vector assaults often exceeded their direct military effects. Enemy commanders facing simultaneous attacks from multiple directions experienced severe cognitive overload as they attempted to assess threats, allocate resources, and maintain control over dispersed forces. The Alpha Legion exploited this psychological dimension deliberately, designing attacks to maximize confusion and uncertainty. They struck at targets in sequences calculated to suggest patterns that did not actually exist, leading enemy commanders to misallocate defensive resources based on false assumptions about Alpha Legion intentions. They created the impression of overwhelming force through carefully timed strikes that made small units appear to be everywhere simultaneously, causing enemies to overestimate the Legion's strength and commit reserves prematurely. The emphasis on attacking enemy command and control reflected the Alpha Legion's understanding that modern military forces depended on information flow and coordinated decision-making. A planetary defense force might possess sufficient firepower to defeat an attacking Space Marine Legion if that force could concentrate its strength at decisive points and coordinate its various elements effectively. However, if communications failed, if commanders received contradictory information about enemy dispositions, if orders never reached frontline units, then that same defensive force became a collection of isolated units that could be defeated piecemeal. The Alpha Legion invested enormous resources in capabilities that degraded enemy command and control, viewing these investments as more valuable than additional combat power. Infiltration operations provided the foundation for most Alpha Legion campaigns. Long before Astartes warriors engaged in direct combat, human operatives and disguised legionaries established themselves within target societies, gathering intelligence about military capabilities, political structures, and cultural vulnerabilities. These infiltrators identified key individuals whose removal or manipulation would create maximum disruption, mapped communications networks and supply chains, and established the infrastructure necessary to support subsequent operations. The intelligence gathered during infiltration phases informed every aspect of mission planning, allowing the Alpha Legion to design operations that exploited specific weaknesses rather than relying on generic tactical approaches. The methods employed during infiltration operations varied based on target characteristics and operational timelines. On worlds with significant civilian populations, Alpha Legion operatives might spend years establishing cover identities as merchants, administrators, or technical specialists, gradually building access to sensitive information and key facilities. These long-term infiltrations required operatives to fully inhabit their cover identities, maintaining their false personas even when not actively gathering intelligence. Some operatives established families, built businesses, and became respected members of their communities, their true allegiance known only to their Alpha Legion handlers. The psychological toll of such extended deception was considerable, but the intelligence value justified the investment. Military infiltration presented different challenges that required different approaches. Disguising Astartes warriors as baseline humans proved difficult given their enhanced physiology, but the Alpha Legion developed techniques that allowed limited infiltration of enemy military forces. Legionaries might pose as members of elite guard units, where their physical capabilities could be attributed to augmentation or genetic enhancement programs. They exploited the confusion of active war zones to insert themselves into enemy formations, claiming to be survivors of destroyed units or reinforcements from distant sectors. Once embedded within enemy military structures, these infiltrators could sabotage equipment, assassinate officers, and feed disinformation to enemy command elements, all while maintaining their cover identities. The use of sleeper agents extended the Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities across decades rather than years. These operatives, both human and Astartes, received assignments that might not activate for generations. A sleeper agent might establish themselves within a planetary government during the Great Crusade, building a career and reputation while awaiting orders that would not come until the Horus Heresy or beyond. This extraordinarily patient approach to intelligence operations reflected the Alpha Legion's willingness to invest resources in capabilities that might not yield immediate returns, but which provided strategic advantages over extended timelines. The existence of these sleeper networks meant that the Alpha Legion maintained presence and capability on worlds that believed themselves entirely free of the Legion's influence. False flag operations represented one of the Alpha Legion's most sophisticated deception techniques. These operations involved conducting attacks or other actions while disguised as different forces, creating false intelligence that shaped enemy decision-making in ways that served Alpha Legion objectives. A false flag operation might involve Alpha Legion operatives disguised as local insurgents attacking government facilities, creating the impression of internal rebellion and causing enemy forces to redeploy from defensive positions to internal security duties. Alternatively, the Legion might conduct attacks while wearing the colors of allied imperial forces, creating friction between allies and undermining coalition cohesion. The success of false flag operations depended on meticulous attention to detail, as any evidence revealing the true perpetrators would undermine the operation's effectiveness. The planning and execution of false flag operations required extensive intelligence about the forces being impersonated. Alpha Legion operatives studied the tactics, equipment, and communication protocols of the forces they intended to mimic, ensuring that their actions would appear authentic to observers. They acquired genuine equipment through theft or battlefield salvage, modified their own gear to match expected patterns, and even adopted the cultural mannerisms and speech patterns of the forces they impersonated. This level of preparation meant that false flag operations often required months of planning before execution, but the strategic effects justified the investment. A successful false flag operation could redirect enemy military efforts for years, creating opportunities that the Alpha Legion could exploit at their leisure. Psychological warfare permeated every aspect of Alpha Legion operations, extending far beyond simple intimidation or demoralization. The Legion studied the psychological characteristics of target populations with the same rigor they applied to military capabilities, identifying cultural fears, social tensions, and cognitive biases that could be exploited. Operations designed to create psychological effects often produced results disproportionate to the resources invested. As populations turned against their governments, military units refused orders, or entire societies collapsed into internal conflict without the Alpha Legion firing more than a handful of shots. The techniques employed in psychological operations ranged from subtle to overt. Propaganda campaigns spread through infiltrated media organizations gradually shifted public opinion on key issues, preparing populations to accept imperial rule or undermining support for existing governments. Targeted assassinations of popular figures created martyrs whose deaths could be attributed to government incompetence or malice, fueling popular unrest. Demonstrations of seemingly supernatural capabilities convinced populations that resistance was futile, as the Alpha Legion staged events that suggested they possessed powers beyond human understanding. The Legion exploited religious beliefs, cultural traditions, and historical grievances, weaponizing elements of target society's own cultures against them. The decapitation strike doctrine represented the most direct application of the Alpha Legion's warfare philosophy. This approach focused on identifying and eliminating enemy leadership, with the understanding that most military organizations could not function effectively once their command structures were destroyed. Unlike the straightforward assassination operations conducted by other legions, Alpha Legion decapitation strikes incorporated extensive analysis of target organizations to predict how they would respond to leadership losses. The Legion did not simply kill enemy commanders, they killed specific commanders at specific times in ways calculated to produce particular organizational responses. The selection of decapitation strike targets reflected sophisticated understanding of organizational dynamics. The Alpha Legion recognized that removing certain leaders would strengthen enemy resistance by allowing more capable individuals to assume command, while eliminating other leaders would create power vacuums that would paralyze enemy decision-making. They studied enemy command cultures to understand succession protocols, identified rivalries that could be exploited, and predicted how different factions within enemy organizations would respond to leadership changes. This analysis informed targeting decisions, with the Legion sometimes deliberately avoiding high-ranking officials in favor of mid-level officers, whose removal would create more significant disruption. The execution of decapitation strikes employed the full range of Alpha Legion capabilities. Headhunter kill teams conducted direct action missions against accessible targets, using superior intelligence and surprise to overcome protective security measures. When targets proved too well defended for direct assault, the Legion employed more subtle approaches, including poisoning, sabotage of transportation or life support systems, and manipulation of target security forces to create opportunities for assassination. Some decapitation operations involved elaborate deceptions that convinced targets to expose themselves to attack, such as false intelligence suggesting safe routes or secure meeting locations, that were actually kill zones prepared by Alpha Legion operatives. The cascading effects of successful decapitation strikes often exceeded the immediate military impact of removing enemy leadership. Organizations that lost their commanders frequently experienced internal power struggles as subordinates competed to fill leadership vacuums. These struggles diverted attention and resources away from military operations, creating opportunities for additional Alpha Legion operations. Communication systems designed around specific commanders became less effective when those commanders were replaced, creating coordination problems that degraded overall military effectiveness. Units that had been trained to follow particular leadership styles struggled to adapt to new commanders with different approaches, reducing combat effectiveness even when replacement leaders possessed adequate competence. Misdirection and misinformation campaigns formed an integral component of nearly every Alpha Legion operation. The Legion understood that enemy decision-making depended on the quality of available intelligence, and they invested heavily in capabilities that corrupted enemy information environments. Rather than simply denying intelligence to enemies, the Alpha Legion actively fed false information through channels that enemy intelligence services would consider reliable. This approach proved far more effective than simple denial, as enemies who believed they possessed accurate intelligence made decisions based on that false information, often committing resources in ways that served Alpha Legion objectives. The creation of false intelligence required deep understanding of enemy intelligence collection methods and analytical processes. The Alpha Legion studied how different organizations gathered information, what sources they considered reliable, and what analytical frameworks they used to interpret raw intelligence. This understanding allowed the Legion to craft false intelligence that would survive enemy analytical scrutiny, incorporating details and corroborating information that made the false intelligence appear authentic. They established false sources that enemy intelligence services would recruit, fed information through multiple channels to create the appearance of independent confirmation, and even sacrificed real intelligence occasionally to maintain the credibility of compromised sources. The manipulation of enemy decision-making through information operations achieved effects that direct military action could not replicate. False intelligence about Alpha Legion force dispositions caused enemies to concentrate defenses in areas the Legion had no intention of attacking, leaving actual objectives vulnerable. Disinformation about Alpha Legion intentions led enemy commanders to adopt defensive postures when aggressive action might have succeeded, or to attack when defense would have been more effective. The Legion created false patterns in their operations that suggested predictable behavior, then exploited enemy expectations by deviating from those patterns at critical moments. This constant manipulation of enemy perceptions created an environment where enemy commanders could never be certain whether their intelligence was accurate, leading to hesitation and suboptimal decision-making even when they possessed genuine information. The integration of all these tactical and operational approaches created a warfare philosophy that treated each campaign as a comprehensive problem requiring customized solutions. The Alpha Legion rejected the standardized approaches that other legions applied across different operational environments, instead analyzing each situation to identify the specific combination of infiltration, deception, psychological operations, and direct action that would achieve objectives most efficiently. This analytical approach required extensive intelligence preparation and careful planning, but it produced results that often appeared disproportionate to the forces actually employed. Planets that might have required years of conventional warfare to conquer fell to the Alpha Legion in weeks or months, their defenses systematically dismantled through operations that targeted the foundations of enemy resistance, rather than simply overwhelming enemy forces through superior combat power. The Alpha Legion's encounter with the Cabal represented a turning point that would fundamentally alter the Legion's trajectory and ultimately determine their role in the galaxy-spanning civil war that became the Horus Heresy. The Cabal itself existed as an ancient conspiracy of Xeno species united by a single overriding purpose: the defeat of chaos in all its manifestations. This organization had operated in the shadows of galactic history for millennia, observing the rise and fall of civilizations while working toward their singular goal. The Cabal's membership included representatives from species that humanity had never encountered, along with some that the Imperium had already marked for extermination. Eldar Farseers who had abandoned their craftworlds to pursue this greater purpose worked alongside members of races whose names existed only in the most obscure xenological archives. The Cabal's interest in humanity, and specifically in the Space Marine legions, stemmed from their recognition that the Emperor's Great Crusade represented a critical juncture in the eternal struggle against chaos. The Xenos seers who guided the Cabal had observed the Primarchs' creation and scattering, understanding that these events were not accidents but deliberate interventions by the ruinous powers. They had watched as the Emperor reunited with his sons and launched humanity's expansion across the galaxy, calculating the probabilities and potential outcomes of this unprecedented military and political undertaking. Their precognitive abilities and millennia of experience fighting chaos allowed them to perceive patterns and possibilities that remained hidden to even the most gifted human psychers. The decision to make contact with the Alpha Legion rather than any other Space Marine legion reflected careful calculation by the Cabal's leadership. They recognized that most legions would respond to Xenos contact with immediate hostility, their loyalty to the Emperor and commitment to humanity's supremacy making them unsuitable candidates for the kind of cooperation the Cabal required. The Alpha Legions demonstrated willingness to employ unconventional methods, their emphasis on intelligence gathering over blind adherence to doctrine, and their apparent independence from the rigid thinking that characterized other legions made them uniquely suited to receive the Cabal's message. The fact that the Legion operated through networks of human agents and demonstrated pragmatic flexibility in their approach to warfare suggested a capacity for the kind of strategic thinking the Cabal's proposal would require. The initial contact between the Cabal and the Alpha Legion occurred through intermediaries rather than direct approach. John Grammaticus, a human perpetual who had lived for thousands of years and served the Cabal for centuries, played a crucial role in establishing this connection. Grammaticus possessed abilities that made him invaluable to the Cabal's purposes. His perpetual nature meant he could not be permanently killed, allowing him to undertake missions that would be suicidal for normal operatives, and his psychic talents enabled communication and manipulation that complemented the Cabal's own capabilities. His human appearance and extensive experience operating within human societies allowed him to approach the Alpha Legion in ways that Xenos operatives could not, reducing the immediate hostility that contact with alien beings would provoke. Grammaticus had spent years studying the Alpha Legion, identifying potential contact points and assessing the likelihood that they would prove receptive to the Cabal's message. He established relationships with some of the Legion's human operatives, carefully building trust while concealing his true purpose and allegiances. These preliminary contacts allowed him to feed information to the Alpha Legion that demonstrated the Cabal's intelligence capabilities and established his credibility as a source worth cultivating. The Alpha Legion, always hungry for intelligence and willing to exploit any source that provided valuable information, gradually allowed Grammaticus deeper access to their networks, unaware that they were being carefully guided toward a confrontation with truths that would challenge everything they believed about their purpose in the galaxy. The actual meeting between the Cabal and representatives of the Alpha Legion occurred at a location far from Imperial space, on a world that existed in the margins between known territories. The Cabal had prepared this meeting with meticulous care, understanding that they would have only one opportunity to present their case before the Alpha Legion either accepted their proposal or attempted to destroy them as Xenos threats to humanity. The meeting site incorporated both security measures to protect the Cabal's members and demonstrations of power, designed to impress upon the Alpha Legion that they faced beings whose capabilities exceeded normal Xenos threats. Ancient technology that predated humanity's emergence as a spacefaring species lined the walls, and the psychic presence of multiple powerful seers created an atmosphere that even the psychically resistant Astartes could perceive. Alpharius and Omegon both attended this meeting, a decision that reflected the significance they attached to this contact. The twins had debated extensively about how to respond to Grammaticus's invitation, recognizing the potential value of the intelligence the Cabal claimed to possess while remaining aware of the dangers inherent in treating with Xenos. Their decision to attend personally, rather than sending subordinates, indicated their assessment that the potential benefits outweighed the risks, and that whatever the Cabal intended to reveal required the attention of the Legion's highest leadership. The twins arrived with appropriate security measures, including multiple layers of backup forces prepared to extract them if the meeting proved to be a trap, but they came prepared to listen rather than simply to fight. The Cabal's representatives presented themselves without deception, making no attempt to disguise their Xenos nature or to pretend allegiance to human interests. This directness served a calculated purpose. The Cabal understood that the Alpha Legion would see through any deception, and that honesty about their nature and purposes would establish credibility more effectively than attempts at manipulation. The Eldar Farseers who spoke for the Cabal explained their organization's history and purpose, describing millennia of struggle against chaos and the accumulated wisdom that came from observing the ruinous powers across countless civilizations and eons. They acknowledged the fundamental conflict between their goals and the Imperium's xenophobic ideology, but argued that the threat posed by chaos transcended species loyalty and required cooperation between beings who would otherwise be enemies. The core of the Cabal's message centered on their analysis of the Horus Heresy before it had fully begun. The Cabal's seers had perceived the corruption spreading through the War Master and had calculated the trajectories that this corruption would follow. They understood that Horus would turn against the Emperor, that other Primarchs would follow him into rebellion, and that the resulting civil war would tear the Imperium apart. This foreknowledge, delivered to the Alpha Legion before the heresy's outbreak became widely known, demonstrated the Cabal's intelligence capabilities in ways that could not be dismissed. The twins recognized that the Cabal possessed information that even the Emperor's own intelligence services had failed to uncover, suggesting capabilities that made them valuable sources regardless of their Xenos nature. The Cabal did not simply provide intelligence about the coming heresy. They presented an analysis of its ultimate consequences that challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty and duty. According to the Cabal's seers, the heresy represented a critical decision point with implications that would echo across millennia. The path forward would determine not just the fate of the Imperium, but the survival of all sentient life in the galaxy. This framing elevated the heresy beyond a simple rebellion against legitimate authority, transforming it into a cosmic struggle whose outcome would affect every species and every world. The Cabal argued that traditional concepts of loyalty to the Emperor or to humanity became irrelevant when measured against stakes of this magnitude. The mechanism through which the Cabal revealed their prophecy became known as the Acuity, a psychic construct that allowed the twins to directly experience visions of possible futures rather than simply hearing descriptions. The Eldar Farseers and other Cabal psychers combined their abilities to create this vision, drawing on precognitive powers refined over millennia and focused through ancient technology that amplified and clarified their foresight. The Acuity was not a simple prediction or probability calculation. It represented a direct perception of the warp's currents and the patterns those currents created in real space. The experience of viewing the Acuity proved profoundly disturbing even for beings as psychologically resilient as the Primarchs, as it forced them to confront futures that contradicted everything they had fought to achieve. The first vision presented through the Acuity showed a future where the Emperor emerged victorious from the Horus Heresy. In this timeline, Loyalist forces defeated the traitor legions after years of brutal warfare that devastated thousands of worlds and killed billions of Imperial citizens. The Emperor survived to continue guiding humanity's expansion across the galaxy, and the Imperium gradually recovered from the Civil War's damage. This future initially appeared to represent the outcome that any loyal servant of the Imperium would desire, the validation of everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. However, as the vision progressed forward through centuries and millennia, a darker pattern emerged. Chaos did not disappear with Horus's defeat. Instead, it continued to grow stronger, feeding on humanity's suffering and the Imperium's increasingly brutal methods of maintaining control. The vision showed humanity's slow corruption across 10,000 years, as the Imperium transformed into a theocratic tyranny that bore little resemblance to the secular empire the Emperor had intended to create. Chaos cults proliferated despite the Imperium's efforts to suppress them, and the ruinous powers grew fat on the suffering generated by humanity's wars and oppression. Each act of violence committed in the Emperor's name fed the Chaos gods. Each prayer offered to the Emperor as a divine being strengthened the very forces he had sought to deny. The Imperium became a perpetual generator of the psychic energy that sustained chaos, trapped in a cycle where its efforts to fight corruption created the conditions for that corruption to spread. Humanity survived in this timeline, but as a species so thoroughly compromised by chaos that its continued existence served the ruinous power's purposes more effectively than its destruction would have. The second vision showed an alternative future where Horus achieved rapid victory over the Emperor. In this timeline, the traitor legions won the civil war within a handful of years, rather than the prolonged conflict shown in the first vision. Horus's forces killed the Emperor, destroyed Terra, and established dominion over the Imperium's territories. The traitor Primarchs, fully committed to chaos and empowered by the ruinous powers, prosecuted a campaign of conquest that brought the entire galaxy under their control. This future appeared to represent absolute victory for chaos, the complete triumph of the dark gods over the Emperor's vision for humanity. The horror of this timeline seemed obvious: humanity enslaved to chaos, the Imperium destroyed, and the ruinous powers ascendant. However, the Acuity's vision continued beyond this apparent chaos victory, revealing consequences that the traitor Primarchs themselves could not foresee. With humanity completely dominated and the Emperor's guiding influence eliminated, chaos turned upon itself with unprecedented ferocity. The Chaos Gods, no longer constrained by the need to coordinate their efforts against Imperial resistance, began competing for dominance with a destructive intensity that consumed their own followers. The traitor legions, transformed into demon princes and chaos spawn, became weapons that the ruinous powers wielded against each other in conflicts that made the Horus heresy appear restrained by comparison. The galaxy burned as chaos fought itself, and in that conflagration, the ruinous powers consumed the very energy that sustained them. The vision showed chaos destroying itself through overreach and internal conflict within a century of Horus's victory. The warp storms that had enabled chaos's ascendance collapsed as the dark gods exhausted themselves through mutual destruction. The demon legions that had swept across the galaxy dissolved as their sustaining energies dissipated. The traitor Primarchs, bound to chaos through their corruption, perished as the powers they served consumed themselves. Humanity suffered catastrophically in this timeline, with billions dead and the species reduced to scattered survivors on worlds devastated by chaos's rampage. However, those survivors would be free of chaos's influence in ways that the first timeline's humanity could never achieve. The species would rebuild from this nadir without the corruption that had compromised the Imperium, potentially emerging stronger and more resistant to chaos's influence than they had been before the heresy. The Cabal's interpretation of these visions formed the foundation of their proposal to the Alpha Legion. They argued that the second timeline, despite its immediate horror and the catastrophic cost to humanity, represented the only path to genuine victory over chaos. The first timeline led to eternal stalemate at best, with humanity serving as an inexhaustible resource that sustained the ruinous powers indefinitely. The second timeline offered actual resolution, a future where chaos destroyed itself and the surviving remnants of humanity could rebuild without the corruption that had plagued the species. The Cabal acknowledged the moral horror of choosing a path that required humanity's near extinction, but they argued that this choice represented the only realistic path to ultimate victory against an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional military means. The implications of this choice confronted Alpharius and Omegon with a decision that transcended normal military or political considerations. The Cabal was not asking them to betray the Emperor out of ambition, resentment, or corruption by chaos. They were proposing a calculated sacrifice of everything the Alpha Legion had fought for, based on the assessment that this sacrifice represented the only path to achieving the Emperor's ultimate goal of protecting humanity from chaos. This framing transformed betrayal from a moral failure into a strategic necessity, from disloyalty into the highest form of loyalty. The Cabal argued that true service to the Emperor's vision required working against the Emperor himself, that saving humanity demanded enabling its temporary destruction. The twins did not make their decision immediately. They withdrew from the meeting with the Cabal to consider the visions they had experienced and the choice those visions presented. The debate between Alpharius and Omegon regarding the proper response to the Cabal's proposal remained private, but the decision they ultimately reached would determine not just their legion's fate, but potentially the future of the entire galaxy. They possessed no way to independently verify the Acuity's visions, no method for confirming that the futures shown were genuine possibilities rather than elaborate deceptions designed to manipulate them into betraying the Imperium. They had to choose based on their assessment of the Cabal's credibility, their own analysis of chaos's nature, and their judgment about which path truly served humanity's long-term interests. The Alpha Legion's ultimate decision to support Horus's rebellion emerged from this deliberation. The twins concluded that the Cabal's analysis was fundamentally sound, that chaos represented an existential threat that conventional military victory could not address, and that the second timeline offered humanity's only realistic chance for ultimate survival. This decision required them to accept that their actions would lead to the Emperor's death, the Imperium's destruction, and the deaths of billions of humans across the galaxy. It required them to betray brothers they had fought alongside, to turn against the Father who had created them, and to work toward outcomes that contradicted everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. The magnitude of this choice cannot be overstated. They were deciding to enable humanity's near extinction based on prophecies delivered by Xeno's seers who served their own agenda. John Grammaticus continued to serve as the primary intermediary between the Cabal and the Alpha Legion after this initial contact. His role expanded beyond simple message delivery to include coordination of operations and provision of intelligence that supported the Legion's new strategic direction. Grammaticus provided information about other Primarchs' loyalties and vulnerabilities, identified opportunities for the Alpha Legion to influence the heresy's development, and served as a channel through which the Cabal could offer guidance without requiring direct contact that might expose the relationship. His perpetual nature made him uniquely valuable for this role, as he could undertake high-risk operations without the permanent consequences that would affect normal operatives. The Alpha Legion's relationship with Grammaticus and other Cabal operatives remained pragmatic rather than trusting. The twins recognized that the Cabal served its own interests, and that those interests might not perfectly align with humanity's welfare, despite the Cabal's stated commitment to fighting chaos. They implemented security measures to prevent the Cabal from gaining excessive influence over Legion operations, compartmentalized information to ensure that Cabal operatives could not compromise the Legion's broader networks, and maintained alternative plans that did not depend on Cabal support. This cautious approach reflected the Alpha Legion's fundamental nature. Even when cooperating with the Cabal toward shared objectives, they refused to become dependent on Xeno's allies, whose ultimate goals remained opaque. The decision to support Horus required the Alpha Legion to begin preparing for betrayal while maintaining the appearance of absolute loyalty to the Emperor. This demanded deception on a scale that challenged even the Alpha Legion's capabilities, as they needed to position resources and establish networks that would support the coming rebellion without alerting Imperial authorities or their brother legions to their true intentions. They began redirecting supplies and equipment to locations where they would be accessible during the heresy, establishing communication channels that would remain functional when Imperial networks failed, and identifying key individuals within Imperial institutions who might be turned or eliminated when the rebellion began. These preparations occurred gradually over months and years, each action appearing innocuous in isolation, but collectively representing a comprehensive effort to undermine the Imperium from within. The Istvan system became the crucible where the Alpha Legion's commitment to the Cabal's vision manifested in open betrayal. The War Master had selected Istvan V as the site where he would eliminate loyalist opposition within the Legion's Astartes, transforming what appeared to be a rebellion suppression operation into a massacre that would shatter any hope of reconciliation between the traitor and loyalist factions. 7 legions received orders to deploy to Istvan V to crush the rebellion that Horus, Mortarion, Fulgrim, and Angron had initiated on Istvan III. The first wave consisted of the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands, who would make planetfall and engage the traitor forces directly. The second wave, comprising the Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors, would deploy after the initial assault to deliver the decisive blow against the rebels. The Loyalist Primarchs commanding the first wave understood the risks inherent in the operation, but trusted that their brother legions in the second wave shared their commitment to the Emperor. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands drove his forces forward with characteristic aggression, determined to bring the traitors to battle and punish their betrayal. Vulcan of the Salamanders advanced more cautiously, his concern for his warriors' survival tempering his assault. Corax of the Raven Guard deployed his forces to exploit gaps in the traitor lines, using the tactics that had made his legion feared across the Great Crusade. The 3 legions made planetfall in drop pods and landing craft, their forces spreading across the volcanic plains of Istvan V as they prepared to engage the entrenched traitor positions. The traitor legions had prepared extensive fortifications across the Urgal Depression, a vast volcanic plain that provided clear fields of fire and limited approach routes for attacking forces. Bunkers, trenches, and weapon emplacements covered the approaches, and the traitor legions had positioned their forces to create overlapping kill zones that would exact a terrible toll on any assault. The Loyalist First Wave advanced into this prepared killing ground, their drop pods and landing craft coming under immediate fire from traitor artillery and air defense systems. Casualties mounted as the Loyalists fought their way inland from their landing zones, but the 3 legions maintained cohesion and continued pressing forward, confident that the second wave would soon arrive to support their assault. The second wave's arrival transformed the battle in ways the Loyalists had not anticipated. The Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors made planetfall behind the Loyalist positions rather than reinforcing their advance. The 4 legions emerged from their landing craft and immediately opened fire on the Loyalist forces, catching them in a crossfire between the entrenched traitors to their front and the newly arrived betrayers to their rear. The shock of this betrayal proved as devastating as the physical damage inflicted by the unexpected assault. Loyalist units that had been advancing in good order suddenly found themselves surrounded, their command structures disrupted by the confusion of determining which forces were friendly and which had turned traitor. The Alpha Legion's role in the drop site massacre demonstrated their capacity for conventional warfare when circumstances required direct engagement. The Legion deployed in force, with multiple companies making planetfall across a broad front that prevented Loyalist forces from concentrating their defenses. Alpha Legion tactical squads advanced in coordinated formations, their bolter fire cutting down Loyalist Astartes who were still attempting to understand what was happening. Heavy weapon teams targeted Loyalist armor and fortified positions, eliminating strongpoints that might have anchored defensive lines. Assault squads struck at command elements and communication nodes, creating the chaos and confusion that had characterized Alpha Legion operations throughout the Great Crusade, but now directed against their former brothers. The massacre unfolded with brutal efficiency as the traitor legions systematically destroyed the Loyalist forces. The Iron Hands suffered catastrophically, with Ferrus Manus himself killed in personal combat with Fulgrim. The Salamanders and Raven Guard fought desperate rearguard actions as they attempted to extract their surviving forces, but the traitor legions pressed their advantage relentlessly. Vulcan disappeared during the fighting, his fate unknown as the Salamanders withdrew. Corax managed to evacuate a portion of his legion, but the Raven Guard had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength. The 3 loyalist legions that had deployed to Istvan V had been effectively destroyed as fighting forces, their combat power eliminated in a single day of treachery. The Alpha Legion's participation in this massacre appeared to confirm their commitment to Horus's rebellion, establishing their credentials as traitors in the eyes of both loyalist and traitor forces. However, the Legion's actions during the broader heresy revealed patterns that contradicted simple allegiance to the War Master. Reports began emerging of Alpha Legion operations that seemed designed to hinder rather than support the traitor war effort, of interventions that aided loyalist forces at critical moments, and of sabotage directed against other traitor legions. These contradictory actions created confusion about the Alpha Legion's true objectives and raised questions about whether their betrayal at Istvan V represented genuine commitment to chaos or something more complex. Intelligence reports from loyalist forces documented instances where Alpha Legion units provided advance warning of traitor attacks, allowing Imperial defenders to prepare defenses that would otherwise have been overwhelmed. These warnings typically came through anonymous channels that prevented confirmation of their source, but the accuracy and specificity of the intelligence suggested access to traitor planning that only another traitor legion could possess. In some cases, Alpha Legion operatives directly contacted loyalist commanders, providing detailed information about traitor force dispositions, supply lines, and operational plans. These contacts occurred too frequently to be explained as isolated incidents of individual legionaries acting against their Primarch's orders, suggesting a systematic effort to aid the loyalist cause even while the Legion officially fought for Horus. Sabotage operations against other traitor legions provided more concrete evidence of the Alpha Legion's ambiguous allegiance. Supply convoys destined for Word-Bearer's forces disappeared en route, their cargoes vanishing without explanation. Ammunition dumps serving Iron Warrior's siege operations exploded under circumstances that suggested deliberate demolition rather than accident or loyalist action. Communication networks that coordinated traitor fleet movements suffered systematic failures that Imperial intelligence services attributed to Alpha Legion cyber warfare operations. These incidents occurred with sufficient frequency that other traitor legions began implementing security measures specifically designed to counter Alpha Legion infiltration, treating their nominal allies with the same suspicion they directed toward loyalist forces. The most significant acts of apparent sabotage involved operations where Alpha Legion forces engaged other traitor legions in direct combat. Several documented instances exist of Alpha Legion units attacking Word-Bearer's positions, claiming the attacks resulted from mistaken identification or communication failures. Other incidents involved Alpha Legion forces withdrawing from critical battles at moments when their continued engagement might have secured traitor victories, their departures attributed to orders from higher command that other traitor commanders never confirmed receiving. These actions created friction within the traitor coalition, as Primarchs like Lorgar and Perturabo questioned whether the Alpha Legion could be trusted to support coordinated operations. The Alpha Legion's assault on Pluto demonstrated their capability to strike at the very heart of the Imperium, while simultaneously revealing the contradictions that characterized their role in the heresy. Pluto served as the outermost bastion of Saul's defenses, its facilities including monitoring stations that tracked all traffic entering and leaving humanity's home system, weapon batteries that could engage hostile forces at extreme range, and garrison forces that could delay any assault long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the inner system. The destruction or capture of Pluto's facilities would blind Imperial defenders to approaching threats and eliminate a significant defensive asset, making it a logical target for traitor forces seeking to assault Terra itself. the Alpha Legion approached Pluto using infiltration methods that had characterized their operations throughout the Great Crusade. Operatives had been inserted into the Plutonian garrison years before the heresy began, establishing themselves within the facility's security forces, technical staff, and administrative personnel. These deep cover agents had maintained their false identities throughout the early stages of the heresy, waiting for orders to activate while continuing to perform their assigned duties within the Imperial Defense Network. When the Alpha Legion fleet arrived in the Outer Sol system, these embedded operatives initiated their missions, sabotaging defensive systems, eliminating key personnel, and creating the confusion necessary for the main assault to succeed. The assault itself combined conventional military force with the information warfare and psychological operations that defined Alpha Legion doctrine. The Legion's fleet emerged from the outer system using approach vectors that the sabotaged monitoring systems failed to detect until the attacking forces had already closed to engagement range. Alpha Legion boarding parties struck at Pluto's orbital facilities, while ground forces made planetfall at locations identified through years of intelligence preparation. The garrison forces, already compromised by Alpha Legion infiltration and reeling from the sudden assault, could not organize effective resistance before critical facilities had been captured or destroyed. Within hours of the assault's commencement, the Alpha Legion controlled Pluto's primary installations and had effectively eliminated the outermost layer of Sol's defenses. However, the Alpha Legion's actions after securing Pluto suggested objectives beyond simple military conquest. Rather than immediately exploiting their success to facilitate follow-on assaults by other traitor forces, the Legion implemented measures that actually hindered further traitor advances into the Sol system. They destroyed certain facilities that would have been valuable for staging additional operations, transmitted false intelligence to traitor command about the ease of penetrating inter-system defenses, and positioned their own forces in ways that blocked approach routes other traitor legions might have used. These actions created delays and confusion that allowed Imperial defenders to reinforce their positions and prepare for the traitor assault that the fall of Pluto should have enabled. The contradictions inherent in the Alpha Legion's conduct during the Battle of Pluto extended to their treatment of captured Imperial personnel. Some prisoners were executed immediately, while others were released with minimal interrogation and allowed to return to Loyalist lines. The pattern of who was killed and who was spared appeared random to outside observers, but analysis of the released prisoners revealed that many occupied positions within the Imperial command structure where they could influence defensive planning. The intelligence these released prisoners provided to their superiors about Alpha Legion capabilities and intentions proved remarkably accurate in some respects and completely misleading in others, creating an information environment where Imperial commanders could never be certain which intelligence to trust. The ambiguous nature of the Alpha Legion's allegiance created operational challenges for both Loyalist and traitor forces throughout the heresy. Loyalist commanders could never be certain whether intelligence apparently originating from Alpha Legion sources represented genuine assistance or elaborate deception designed to lead Imperial forces into traps. The Legion's documented instances of aiding Loyalist forces might be genuine attempts to undermine the traitor cause, or they might be calculated sacrifices intended to establish credibility for more significant deceptions later. This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making in some cases, as Loyalist officers debated whether to act on intelligence that might save thousands of lives or might lead their forces to destruction. Traitor forces faced similar difficulties in working with the Alpha Legion. The other traitor Primarchs recognized the Legion's value for intelligence gathering and special operations, but could never be entirely confident that Alpha Legion units would execute assigned missions as directed. Operations that required coordination between the Alpha Legion and other traitor forces often suffered from communication problems, missed timing windows, and unexplained failures that might have resulted from incompetence, deliberate sabotage, or simply the chaos inherent in military operations. The Word-Bearers and Iron Warriors, in particular, began excluding the Alpha Legion from planning for major operations, preferring to operate without their support rather than risk the complications their involvement might create. The Alpha Legion's own legionaries operated under this cloud of uncertainty regarding their true objectives. The compartmentalized structure that had characterized the Legion since before the heresy meant that individual cells often possessed no knowledge of the broader strategic picture. A squad conducting sabotage operations against a word-bearer's supply depot might believe they were acting on orders from Alpharius to undermine a rival traitor legion's capabilities, unaware that this sabotage served the Cabal's agenda of ensuring Horus's rapid victory. Another cell providing intelligence to loyalist forces might understand their actions as genuine assistance to the Emperor's cause, not knowing that this assistance had been calculated to produce specific effects that ultimately served the Cabal's vision of chaos's self-destruction. This deliberate confusion about objectives and allegiances extended to the highest levels of the Legion's command structure. The twin Primarchs maintained separate networks of operatives, with some cells reporting to Alpharius and others to Omegon, and the two Primarchs did not always share information about their respective operations. This division created situations where different elements of the Legion pursued contradictory objectives, with neither the legionaries involved nor outside observers able to determine which actions represented the Legion's true intentions. The possibility existed that Alpharius and Omegon themselves disagreed about the proper implementation of the Cabal's vision, with one twin genuinely committed to ensuring Horus's rapid victory, while the other harbored doubts about the wisdom of enabling Chaos's temporary triumph. Reports from the heresy's later stages documented instances where Alpha Legion forces engaged each other in combat, though whether these represented genuine internal conflicts or elaborate deceptions designed to confuse observers remained unclear. Some accounts described Alpha Legion units defending Imperial positions against other Alpha Legion forces, creating battles where both sides wore the same colors and used the same tactics. These incidents might have resulted from the cellular structure creating genuine confusion about which forces were friendly, or they might have been staged performances designed to maintain the Legion's reputation for unpredictability, while actually serving coordinated objectives that neither side's apparent actions revealed. The question of whether the Alpha Legion had actually been corrupted by chaos during the heresy added another layer of ambiguity to their actions. Unlike the word-bearers, who openly embraced chaos worship, or the Emperor's children and world eaters, whose descent into madness was obvious to any observer, the Alpha Legion showed no clear signs of corruption. Their operations maintained the calculated precision that had characterized them before the heresy, and their legionaries did not display the mutations or behavioral changes that marked other traitor legions. This apparent resistance to corruption might have indicated that the Legion had avoided the taint that consumed their traitor brothers, or it might have suggested that their corruption took more subtle forms that outside observers could not detect. The Alpha Legion's relationship with the Cabal continued throughout the heresy, though the frequency and nature of their contacts remained known only to the Primarchs and perhaps a handful of senior Legion officers. John Grammaticus maintained his role as intermediary, though his own doubts about the Cabal's vision grew as he witnessed the heresy's devastation firsthand. The Perpetual began questioning whether the cost of the Cabal's chosen path truly justified the potential benefits, whether the visions shown through the Acuity represented genuine prophecy or manipulated possibilities, and whether the Xenos seers who guided the Cabal actually understood humanity well enough to predict how the species would respond to near extinction. These doubts created tensions in his relationship with both the Cabal and the Alpha Legion, as he struggled to reconcile his role in enabling catastrophic events with his residual loyalty to humanity. The strategic impact of the Alpha Legion's contradictory actions during the heresy proved difficult to assess, as their operations affected both loyalist and traitor efforts in ways that might have been decisive or might have been largely irrelevant to the conflict's ultimate outcome. The intelligence they provided to loyalist forces potentially saved worlds from conquest and allowed Imperial defenders to achieve victories that would otherwise have been impossible. The sabotage they directed against other traitor legions might have delayed the assault on Terra and provided the Emperor with time to prepare defenses that would prove crucial in the final battle. Alternatively, these actions might have been elaborate theater that created the appearance of divided loyalties, while actually serving the Cabal's agenda of ensuring Horus's rapid victory, followed by Chaos's self-destruction. The Alpha Legion's true motivations during the Horus Heresy remained opaque even to their traitor allies, creating a situation where every action could be interpreted in multiple ways and no interpretation could be confirmed or refuted with certainty. This ambiguity served the Legion's interests by preventing enemies from predicting their actions or countering their operations effectively, but it also isolated them from both loyalist and traitor forces, creating a situation where the Alpha Legion fought alone regardless of which side they claimed to support at any given moment. The twins had chosen a path that required them to be trusted by neither loyalists nor traitors, to operate in the spaces between allegiances where their true objectives remained hidden behind layers of deception that might never be fully penetrated. The heresy became for the Alpha Legion not a simple choice between loyalty and betrayal, but a complex operation where every action served multiple purposes and where success or failure could not be measured by conventional military metrics. The aftermath of the Horus Heresy left the Imperium fractured and bleeding, with the traitor legions scattered into the Eye of Terror and the Loyalists struggling to maintain order across a galaxy that had been devastated by 7 years of civil war. The Alpha Legion, whose role during the heresy had been characterized by contradictions and ambiguity, did not flee into the warp alongside the other traitor forces. Instead, elements of the Legion remained active in Imperial space, continuing operations that defied easy categorization as either purely hostile or inexplicably beneficial to Imperial interests. This pattern of behavior created confusion among Imperial military commanders attempting to assess the threat the Alpha Legion represented and how to respond to their continued presence. Roboute Guilliman, who had spent the latter stages of the heresy organizing the defense of Ultramar against Word-Bearers' incursions, emerged from the conflict determined to hunt down the traitor legions and exact vengeance for their betrayal. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had witnessed firsthand the devastation that the traitors had inflicted on the Imperium, had seen worlds burned and populations slaughtered, and had lost brothers he had fought alongside for decades. His response to this trauma manifested in a methodical campaign to pursue fleeing traitor forces, denying them safe haven and destroying their capacity to threaten the Imperium. The Alpha Legion became a priority target for these pursuit operations, both because of their participation in the drop site massacre and because their continued operations in Imperial space made them more accessible than traitor legions that had retreated into the Eye of Terror. The world of Escrador entered Imperial records as the site where Guilliman's pursuit of the Alpha Legion reached its conclusion, though the details of what actually occurred on that world remain contested and contradictory. Official Ultramarines accounts describe Escrador as a remote world on the fringes of Imperial space, a planet whose harsh environment and limited strategic value had kept it largely ignored during the Great Crusade. The world's surface consisted primarily of dense jungle broken by volcanic mountain ranges, terrain that favored the kind of guerrilla warfare at which the Alpha Legion excelled. Imperial intelligence services had tracked Alpha Legion forces to Escrador following a series of raids on Ultramarine supply lines, operations that had inflicted significant casualties while revealing little about the Legion's broader objectives or force disposition. Guilliman deployed a substantial Ultramarines force to Escrador, bringing multiple chapters and significant fleet assets to ensure that the Alpha Legion could not escape once engaged. The Ultramarines approached the operation with the methodical planning that characterized all of Guilliman's military endeavors, conducting extensive reconnaissance before committing ground forces and establishing orbital superiority to prevent Alpha Legion extraction. The Primarch himself took personal command of the operation, his presence intended to demonstrate the Imperium's commitment to bringing the traitors to justice and to provide the leadership necessary to counter the Alpha Legion's unconventional tactics. The initial phases of the Escrador campaign followed patterns familiar from previous counter-insurgency operations. Ultramarines' forces made planetfall at multiple locations, establishing fortified bases from which they could conduct sweeps through the surrounding terrain. Scout units pushed into the jungle, searching for signs of Alpha Legion presence, while specialized teams investigated sites identified through orbital surveillance as potential enemy positions. The Ultramarines employed tactics developed through centuries of warfare, using their superior numbers and firepower to systematically clear sectors and deny the Alpha Legion room to maneuver. The operation proceeded according to Guilliman's planning, with Ultramarines' forces gradually tightening their cordon around areas where intelligence suggested the Alpha Legion had concentrated their strength. The Alpha Legion responded to the Ultramarines' deployment with the asymmetric warfare methods that had defined their operations throughout the Great Crusade and Heresy. Rather than concentrating their forces to defend specific positions, they dispersed into small units that conducted raids against Ultramarine supply lines, communication nodes, and isolated outposts. These attacks inflicted steady casualties without offering the Ultramarines opportunities for decisive engagement, forcing Guilliman's forces to spread their strength across a wide area to protect their logistics infrastructure. Alpha Legion operatives who had infiltrated the Ultramarines expedition before planetfall sabotaged equipment fed false intelligence to Ultramarines commanders and created confusion about the Legion's actual strength and disposition. The terrain of Escrador heavily favored the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare. The dense jungle canopy defeated many of the Ultramarine surveillance systems, allowing Alpha Legion units to move without detection and strike from unexpected directions. The volcanic activity that characterized much of the planet's surface created interference that degraded communications and sensor equipment, forcing Ultramarines units to operate with less coordination than their doctrine required. The Alpha Legion had spent weeks or possibly months preparing the battlefield before the Ultramarines arrived, establishing supply caches, identifying ambush sites, and mapping routes that allowed rapid movement through terrain that appeared impassable to forces less familiar with the environment. According to Ultramarines' accounts, the confrontation between Guilliman and Alpharius occurred during an Ultramarine sweep through a particularly dense section of jungle near one of Escrador's volcanic ranges. Guilliman had been leading a strike force personally, his presence intended to draw out the Alpha Legion leadership for a decisive engagement. The Ultramarines' force had been advancing through difficult terrain when they encountered an Alpha Legion defensive position that appeared more substantial than the temporary fighting positions the Legion had used in previous engagements. The position incorporated prepared fortifications and heavy weapons emplacements, suggesting that the Alpha Legion intended to make a stand rather than continuing their pattern of hit-and-run attacks. The Ultramarines' assault on this position developed into a sustained engagement that lasted several hours, with Guilliman's forces systematically reducing the Alpha Legion defenses through the application of overwhelming firepower and coordinated infantry assaults. The Alpha Legion defenders fought with determination that seemed inconsistent with their previous emphasis on avoiding decisive engagement, holding their positions even as Ultramarines' forces breached their outer defenses and pushed toward the position's center. This uncharacteristic behavior should have suggested to the Ultramarines that something about the engagement deviated from expected patterns, but the intensity of combat and the opportunity to finally bring Alpha Legion forces to battle apparently overrode concerns about potential deception. The climactic moment of the engagement occurred when Guilliman personally led the final assault on the Alpha Legion position's command center. The Primarch of the Ultramarines fought through the remaining defenders, his power fist crushing armor and breaking weapons as he carved a path toward the chamber where intelligence suggested the enemy commander directed the defense. Guilliman entered this chamber to find a figure in Alpha Legion Primarch armor, a warrior whose stature and bearing identified him as Alpharius despite the helmet that concealed his features. The two Primarchs engaged in single combat while their respective forces fought throughout the surrounding structure, the clash of their weapons audible even over the sounds of bolter fire and explosions. The duel between Guilliman and the figure, identified as Alpharius, lasted only minutes according to witnesses, though accounts vary regarding specific details of the combat. Guilliman's superior size and strength proved decisive advantages in close-quarters fighting, and the Ultramarines Primarch wielded the Hand of Dominion with devastating effect. The power fist connected with Alpharius's armor repeatedly, each blow cracking ceramite and driving the Alpha Legion Primarch backward. Guilliman pressed his advantage relentlessly, giving his opponent no opportunity to recover or employ the kind of tactical maneuvering that might have offset the Ultramarines Primarch's physical advantages. The final blow struck Alpharius's helmet with sufficient force to shatter both the armor and the skull beneath, killing the Alpha Legion Primarch instantly. The death of their Primarch should have broken the Alpha Legion's resistance, as the loss of such a central figure would devastate any Space Marine Legion's morale and command structure. Instead, the Alpha Legion forces on Escrador intensified their attacks following Alpharius's reported death, conducting operations with increased aggression and apparent disregard for casualties. This response contradicted normal patterns of Space Marine behavior following Primarch death, where legions typically withdrew to regroup and mourn their fallen leader. The Alpha Legion's continued resistance suggested either extraordinary discipline or the possibility that Alpharius's death had not affected the Legion's command structure in the ways that Guilliman had anticipated. The Ultramarines eventually achieved tactical control of Escrador after weeks of additional fighting, but the victory proved far more costly than Guilliman had projected when planning the operation. Ultramarines' casualties exceeded those suffered in many major engagements during the heresy, with entire companies effectively destroyed through accumulated losses from Alpha Legion ambushes and raids. The Alpha Legion forces that had been present on Escrador largely escaped despite the Ultramarines' orbital blockade, using methods that remained unclear even after extensive investigation. Supply dumps that should have sustained Alpha Legion operations for months were found abandoned, suggesting that the Legion had maintained alternative logistics networks that Ultramarines' intelligence had failed to identify. The contradictions inherent in the official account of Escrador became apparent almost immediately after the campaign concluded. The body identified as Alpharius disappeared during the extraction from Escrador, with Ultramarines' records offering conflicting explanations for this loss. Some accounts claim that Alpha Legion operatives infiltrated the Ultramarines' fleet and recovered their Primarch's remains, while others suggested that the body was lost during a warp transit accident. The absence of physical evidence made it impossible to confirm that the warrior Guilliman had killed was actually Alpharius rather than a legionary wearing Primarch armor, a deception that would have been entirely consistent with Alpha Legion practices throughout their history. Alternative accounts of Alpharius's death complicated the narrative further by placing the event at Pluto rather than Escrador. These sources described a confrontation between Rogel Dorn and Alpharius during the Alpha Legion's assault on the Sol system's outer defenses, with the Imperial Fist's Primarch killing his brother in ship-to-ship combat. The details of this alternative account included specific tactical information about the Pluto engagement that suggested genuine knowledge of the operation rather than simple fabrication. If this version was accurate, then the figure Guilliman killed on Escrador could not have been Alpharius, raising questions about whether it was Omegon or simply another Alpha Legion warrior assuming the Primarch's identity. The existence of Omegon provided an obvious explanation for the contradictions surrounding Alpharius's death. If one twin had fallen at Pluto and the other at Escrador, then both accounts could be accurate, while neither fully captured the truth of what had occurred. Alternatively, if one twin survived both engagements, then at least one of the reported deaths must have been a deception, with an Alpha Legion warrior sacrificing himself while claiming his Primarch's identity. The Alpha Legion's long-established practice of identity assumption made it impossible to determine with certainty which scenario was correct, as the Legion had spent decades creating exactly this kind of confusion about their Primarchs' identities and whereabouts. The strategic implications of Alpharius's reported death proved minimal regardless of whether the event actually occurred. The Alpha Legion continued operating with the same effectiveness after Escrador as before, conducting raids and infiltration operations that demonstrated no degradation in capability or coordination. This continuity suggested either that Omegon had survived to maintain the Legion's command structure, that the Legion's cellular organization allowed it to function effectively without Primarch leadership, or that neither twin had actually died, and the entire narrative of Primarch death at Escrador or Pluto was elaborate misdirection. The Alpha Legion offered no clarification regarding their Primarch's fate, and subsequent encounters with warriors claiming to be Alpharius continued to occur for centuries after the heresy. Conspiracy theories regarding Escrador proliferated within Imperial intelligence services and among scholars attempting to understand the Alpha Legion's history. Some analysts questioned whether Escrador existed at all, noting that the world appeared in no pre-heresy charts and that its location remained vaguely defined in official records. These skeptics suggested that the entire Escrador campaign might have been fabricated, either by the Ultramarines to claim a victory over the Alpha Legion that never actually occurred, or by the Alpha Legion themselves to fake their Primarch's death and reduce Imperial pursuit efforts. The absence of independent verification for the campaign's events, combined with the Alpha Legion's demonstrated capacity for large-scale deception, made these theories impossible to definitively refute. The tactical lessons that the Ultramarines claimed to have learned from Escrador appeared in subsequent editions of the Codex Astartes, Guilliman's comprehensive manual of space marine organization and tactics. The sections addressing counter-insurgency operations and asymmetric warfare incorporated techniques allegedly developed during the Escrador campaign, suggesting that Guilliman considered the engagement significant enough to influence his doctrinal thinking. However, the specific tactical recommendations included in these sections focused primarily on methods for countering Alpha Legion infiltration and deception, raising questions about whether the real lessons of Escrador concerned military tactics, or the dangers of assuming that any engagement with the Alpha Legion could be understood at face value. The Alpha Legion's own records regarding Escrador, to the extent that such records existed and could be trusted, reportedly contradicted the Ultramarines' account in significant ways. Alpha Legion sources described the campaign as a deliberate operation to inflict maximum casualties on the Ultramarines, while creating confusion about the Legion's command structure and capabilities. According to these accounts, the warrior killed by Guilliman had volunteered for the role, understanding that his sacrifice would serve the Legion's broader objectives by convincing the Imperium that Alpharius was dead, while the actual Primarchs continued directing Legion operations from secure locations. This version of events portrayed Escrador not as an Ultramarines victory, but as an Alpha Legion success that achieved its objectives despite the loss of warriors and materiel. The question of which twin, if either, died during the heresy and its immediate aftermath remained unresolved millennia after the events in question. The Alpha Legion's practice of both twins using the Alpharius identity, combined with the widespread adoption of that identity by regular legionaries, created a situation where determining the truth became impossible without access to information that the Legion guarded absolutely. Even if one or both twins had died, the Legion could continue claiming that Alpharius lived by having other warriors assume the identity, maintaining the fiction of Primarch leadership indefinitely. This capacity for indefinite deception meant that any claims about the twins' fate should be treated with extreme skepticism, regardless of the apparent credibility of sources making those claims. The impact of the reported Primarch death on Alpha Legion operations proved remarkably limited, suggesting that the Legion's organizational structure had been designed to function independently of Primarch leadership from its inception. The cellular organization that characterized Alpha Legion operations meant that individual cells could continue executing their missions based on standing orders and established doctrine without requiring direct Primarch guidance. The compartmentalization that prevented cells from knowing details of other operations ensured that the loss of central leadership would not compromise ongoing missions or expose the Legion's broader strategic planning. This resilience to leadership decapitation represented the ultimate expression of the Alpha Legion's warfare philosophy, creating an organization that could survive and adapt to any loss, including that of its founding Primarchs. The decades following Escrador saw continued Alpha Legion activity across Imperial space, with the Legion conducting operations that ranged from obvious attacks on Imperial facilities to subtle infiltrations whose purposes remained unclear. The pattern of contradictory actions that had characterized the Legion during the Heresy persisted, with some operations appearing designed to harm Imperial interests, while others seemed calculated to aid the Imperium against threats from other traitor legions or Xenos forces. This ongoing ambiguity prevented Imperial authorities from developing effective counter-strategies, as any approach designed to address one aspect of Alpha Legion behavior proved ineffective against other aspects that contradicted the initial pattern. The Escrador campaign's true significance lay not in determining whether Alpharius actually died, but in demonstrating the Alpha Legion's fundamental resistance to conventional military solutions. Guilliman had deployed overwhelming force, employed sound tactical doctrine, and achieved what appeared to be a decisive victory, including the death of an enemy Primarch. Yet the Alpha Legion emerged from the campaign with their operational capabilities intact, their strategic objectives apparently achieved, and their enemies more confused about their nature and intentions than before the engagement. This outcome validated the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare, while highlighting the limitations of conventional military thinking when applied to enemies who rejected conventional military logic. Whether Alpharius died on Escrador, at Pluto, or continued living for centuries after the Heresy became less important than the recognition that the Alpha Legion had created an organization that transcended dependence on any individual, including their Primarchs. The Alpha Legion's transition from a unified military force into a constellation of independent cells and warbands began during the Scouring, that brutal period following the Horus Heresy when Loyalist forces pursued the traitor legions across the galaxy. While other traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror to regroup and rebuild under the protection of the Warp, the Alpha Legion fragmented deliberately rather than retreating as a cohesive force. This fragmentation reflected both practical necessity and strategic calculation. The cellular structure that had defined the Legion since before the Heresy made such dispersal natural, as individual cells already operated with significant autonomy and could continue their missions without constant direction from central command. The reported death of Alpharius, whether genuine or fabricated, provided additional impetus for this dispersal by removing the unifying figure that might have held the Legion together as a single entity. The cells that emerged from this fragmentation varied enormously in size, composition, and objectives. Some consisted of a single squad that had been operating deep undercover when the Heresy ended, and simply continued their existing missions for decades or centuries afterward. Others comprised company-sized formations that had fought together throughout the Heresy and maintained their cohesion as they pursued objectives their commanders believed aligned with the Legion's original purpose. A few warbands grew to include thousands of warriors, attracting Alpha Legion veterans from other cells, along with recruits from renegade Imperial forces and populations conquered during their campaigns. This diversity of scale and organization meant that the Alpha Legion ceased to exist as a unified military force in any conventional sense, becoming instead a network of loosely affiliated groups that shared common origins and tactical doctrines, but pursued independent strategic agendas. The question of what objectives these cells actually pursued became one of the great mysteries of the Long War. Each cell operated according to its commander's interpretation of the Legion's mission, and those interpretations diverged dramatically as the centuries accumulated distance from the Heresy and the original context that had shaped the Legion's choices. Some cells clearly embraced chaos worship, their warriors bearing mutations that marked them as devotees of the ruinous powers and conducting operations designed to spread corruption and summon demons. These corrupted warbands had abandoned whatever original purpose had guided their actions during the heresy, becoming indistinguishable from other Chaos Space Marine forces, except for their continued use of Alpha Legion tactics and iconography. Other cells maintained that they remained loyal to the Emperor, despite their nominal traitor status, claiming that their actions served the Imperium's interests even when those actions appeared overtly hostile. These cells conducted operations against other Chaos forces, sabotaged traitor Legion campaigns, and occasionally provided intelligence to Imperial authorities through anonymous channels. Their commanders argued that the Alpha Legion's betrayal during the heresy had been a strategic necessity designed to achieve objectives that required working outside Imperial command structures, and that their continued operations represented the prosecution of a war that most of the Imperium could not understand or acknowledge. Whether these claims reflected genuine loyalty or elaborate rationalization for pursuing personal agendas remained impossible to determine from outside the cells making such assertions. The majority of Alpha Legion cells operated in the ambiguous space between these extremes, conducting operations that served their own interests without clear alignment to either Imperial or Chaos objectives. These warbands raided Imperial worlds for supplies and recruits, fought against other Chaos forces when their territories overlapped, and pursued goals that appeared comprehensible only to their commanders. Some cells seemed focused on accumulating resources and establishing hidden bases throughout the galaxy, building infrastructure that might support some future operation whose nature remained unclear. Others conducted intelligence-gathering operations that collected vast amounts of information about Imperial military dispositions, Xenos movements, and Chaos warband activities without any obvious purpose for this intelligence beyond simply possessing it. The fragmentation of command authority that accompanied the Legion's dispersal created situations where different Alpha Legion cells pursued contradictory objectives without coordination or even awareness of each other's existence. A cell might spend years infiltrating an Imperial hive world to prepare for an uprising, only to have another cell sabotage their operation because that second cell believed the world's continued Imperial control served some broader strategic purpose. Alpha Legion warbands fought each other over territory, resources, and ideological differences about the Legion's proper role in the Long War. These internecine conflicts occurred with sufficient frequency that Imperial intelligence services learned to exploit them, feeding information to different cells calculated to provoke confrontations that would eliminate Alpha Legion presence in specific regions without requiring direct Imperial military intervention. Notable Alpha Legion operations throughout the 10 millennia following the heresy demonstrated the range of capabilities and objectives that characterized different cells. The Castoral Novum campaign in the 41st millennium showcased the Legion's continued mastery of infiltration and deception, as Alpha Legion operatives spent years preparing a world for conquest before revealing their presence. The cell responsible for this operation had embedded agents within the planetary government, military command structure, and even the local Adeptus Arbites garrison. When the Alpha Legion finally struck, these embedded agents sabotaged defensive systems, assassinated key officers, and created chaos that allowed a relatively small Alpha Legion force to conquer a heavily defended world within days. The operation demonstrated that individual cells retained the tactical sophistication that had characterized the Legion during the Great Crusade, even when operating independently without support from the broader Legion. The Tenebrae installation incident revealed a different aspect of Alpha Legion operations during the Long War. Imperial Navy forces investigating reports of Xenos activity in an uninhabited system discovered a massive orbital facility whose construction predated the Imperium itself. The installation incorporated technology that the Mechanicum could not fully understand, including data archives that contained information about threats the Imperium would not encounter for centuries. Alpha Legion forces appeared within hours of the Imperial Navy's arrival, fighting with desperate intensity to prevent Imperial access to the facility. The engagement ended with the installation's destruction. Whether through Alpha Legion demolition charges or Imperial bombardment remained unclear, but the operation suggested that some Alpha Legion cells pursued objectives related to ancient technology or forbidden knowledge rather than simple military conquest. False flag operations remained a favored Alpha Legion tactic throughout the Long War, with cells conducting attacks while disguised as other forces to achieve strategic effects that direct action could not produce. The Vrax Rebellion, which consumed an entire sector in warfare lasting decades, allegedly began with Alpha Legion operatives posing as inquisitorial agents and feeding false intelligence to both Imperial and local forces. The resulting conflict drew in multiple Imperial Guard regiments, Space Marine chapters, and eventually demonic forces, creating a meat grinder that consumed millions of lives while serving no clear Alpha Legion objective beyond demonstrating their capacity to manipulate Imperial institutions into self-destructive actions. Similar operations occurred across the Imperium, with Alpha Legion cells creating conflicts between Imperial factions, provoking wars with Xeno species, and generally sowing chaos in ways that suggested either brilliant strategic planning or simple malicious opportunism, depending on one's interpretation. The question of chaos corruption within the Alpha Legion became increasingly complex as the millennia progressed and different cells followed divergent paths. Some warbands clearly fell to chaos completely, their warriors bearing the marks of demonic possession and mutation that indicated deep corruption by the ruinous powers. These corrupted cells conducted operations indistinguishable from other Chaos Space Marine warbands, summoning demons, establishing cult networks, and spreading corruption wherever they operated. The warriors in these warbands retained Alpha Legion tactical doctrines and organizational structures, but their objectives had been subsumed by chaos worship and the pursuit of demonic ascension. Reports existed of Alpha Legion sorcerers wielding powers granted by the Chaos Gods, of possessed warriors leading corrupted warbands, and of entire cells that had pledged themselves to specific chaos deities. Other cells demonstrated remarkable resistance to chaos corruption despite millennia of operating outside Imperial authority and frequent exposure to warp phenomena. These warbands maintained the discipline and calculated approach to warfare that had characterized the Legion before the heresy, showing no signs of the mutations or madness that afflicted most Chaos Space Marines. Their warriors fought with the precision of loyalist Space Marines, employed tactics that emphasized intelligence and planning over berserker rage or sorcerous power, and apparently retained the mental clarity necessary for long-term strategic thinking. Whether this resistance to corruption stemmed from some inherent protection built into the Legion's gene seed, from active measures the cells took to resist chaos influence, or from some other factor remained unknown to Imperial observers. The existence of apparently uncorrupted Alpha Legion cells operating 10,000 years after the heresy raised disturbing questions about their true nature and objectives. Chaos corruption typically affected all traitor Space Marines eventually, the warp's influence gradually transforming even the most disciplined warriors into something monstrous. That some Alpha Legion cells apparently avoided this fate suggested either extraordinary discipline or the possibility that they maintained some connection to the Emperor's original vision that protected them from corruption. Imperial theologians and inquisitors who studied the Alpha Legion debated whether such protection was even possible for warriors who had betrayed the Emperor, or whether the apparent lack of corruption was itself a form of chaos deception, more subtle than obvious mutation. The persistent rumors that some Alpha Legion cells continued working toward the original goal of saving humanity, even through treachery and apparent betrayal, found support in documented instances of Alpha Legion forces aiding the Imperium against existential threats. During the 13th Black Crusade, when Abaddon the Despoiler launched his most successful assault on the Cadian Gate, reports emerged of Alpha Legion forces sabotaging other Chaos Warband operations, providing intelligence to Imperial defenders, and conducting strikes against critical chaos infrastructure. These interventions could not be attributed to simple opportunism or internecine chaos conflicts, as they appeared coordinated and timed to provide maximum benefit to imperial defensive efforts. Similar patterns appeared during major Tyranid invasions, orc wars, and other crises where the Imperium faced threats that could potentially destroy humanity entirely. The interpretation of these apparent acts of assistance divided Imperial authorities and Alpha Legion analysts. Some argued that the cells providing such aid genuinely believed they served the Emperor's ultimate purpose, that they had maintained loyalty to humanity, if not to the Imperium's specific institutional forms. This interpretation suggested that the Alpha Legion's betrayal during the heresy had indeed been motivated by strategic calculation rather than simple corruption, and that some cells continued prosecuting a war against chaos that required them to operate outside Imperial command structures. Others contended that these interventions represented elaborate deceptions designed to create confusion about Alpha Legion objectives, that any apparent assistance to Imperial forces served some ulterior purpose that would only become clear when the Alpha Legion sprung whatever trap they were preparing. The cellular structure that had characterized the Legion since its founding made it impossible to generalize about Alpha Legion objectives or loyalties, as each cell operated according to its own interpretation of the Legion's purpose and its commander's assessment of how best to serve that purpose. A cell that genuinely sought to protect humanity from chaos might operate in the same sector as another cell that had fully embraced chaos worship, with neither aware of the other's existence or objectives. This fragmentation meant that the Alpha Legion as a unified entity ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by a collection of independent warbands that shared common origins and tactics, but pursued fundamentally incompatible goals. The recruitment practices employed by different Alpha Legion cells varied as dramatically as their objectives and corruption levels. Some cells maintained the Legion's traditional emphasis on intelligence and adaptability, recruiting from populations that demonstrated these qualities and subjecting candidates to extensive psychological evaluation before implantation with gene seed. These cells produced warriors who resembled the original Alpha Legion in capability and mindset, perpetuating the Legion's distinctive approach to warfare across generations. Other cells recruited more indiscriminately, accepting any candidates who could survive the implantation process and using them as expendable assets for high-risk operations. The resulting warriors lacked the sophistication of traditionally trained Alpha Legion operatives, but provided numerical strength for cells that prioritized quantity over quality. The gene seed used by Alpha Legion cells presented another source of variation and concern. Some cells maintained access to original Alpha Legion gene seed, carefully preserving this resource, and using it sparingly to create new warriors who carried the genetic legacy of Alpharius and Omegon. Other cells had lost access to their original gene seed stocks and resorted to using gene seed harvested from other legions, creating warriors who bore Alpha Legion colors and fought according to Alpha Legion tactics, but whose genetic heritage derived from different Primarchs. The most corrupted cells used gene seed that had been warped by chaos, producing warriors whose bodies incorporated demonic elements and whose minds had been touched by the warp even before their indoctrination. This diversity of genetic lineages meant that the term Alpha Legion increasingly referred to a tactical and organizational tradition rather than a coherent genetic brotherhood. The intelligence networks that individual Alpha Legion cells maintained represented perhaps their most valuable strategic asset and the capability that most clearly connected them to the Legion's original character. Even small cells often controlled extensive networks of human agents, cultists, and informants that provided intelligence about Imperial activities, enemy movements, and opportunities for exploitation. These networks operated with the same compartmentalization and tradecraft that had characterized Alpha Legion intelligence operations during the Great Crusade, with individual agents knowing only their specific roles and lacking awareness of the broader network scope or objectives. The cells invested heavily in maintaining these networks, recognizing that information superiority provided advantages that offset their limited numbers and resources. The relationship between different Alpha Legion cells and the broader Chaos Space Marine community proved complex and often hostile. Other traitor legions viewed the Alpha Legion with suspicion and distrust, their fragmented nature and ambiguous objectives making them unreliable allies at best and potential threats at worst. The Word-Bearers particularly despised Alpha Legion cells that refused to embrace chaos worship, viewing their resistance to corruption as evidence of weakness or hidden loyalty to the Emperor. The Iron Warriors competed with Alpha Legion cells for resources and territory, their conflicts often escalating into open warfare that consumed both sides' strength without clear strategic purpose. Even the Black Legion, which incorporated warriors from all traitor legions under Abaddon's leadership, struggled to integrate Alpha Legion veterans who maintained their distinctive operational methods and refused to fully subordinate themselves to unified command. The tactics employed by Alpha Legion cells during the Long War evolved to address new threats and exploit new technologies while maintaining the core principles that had defined the Legion since its founding. Cells operating in the 41st millennium incorporated equipment and techniques that would have been foreign to their Heresy-era predecessors, including advanced void warfare capabilities, sophisticated cyber warfare tools, and weapons systems developed during 10 millennia of technological stagnation and occasional innovation. However, the fundamental approach remained consistent: achieve objectives through intelligence superiority, deception, and precisely applied force rather than through overwhelming military power. A modern Alpha Legion cell infiltrating a hive world used different tools than their predecessors would have employed during the Great Crusade, but the operational logic remained unchanged. The geographic distribution of Alpha Legion cells across the galaxy reflected both strategic calculation and historical accident. Some cells operated in regions where the Legion had maintained presence since the Heresy, their territories passed down through generations of commanders who viewed specific sectors as their responsibility to monitor and influence. Other cells ranged widely across Imperial space, never maintaining permanent bases, and instead operating as nomadic forces that struck targets of opportunity before disappearing into the void. A few cells established themselves in the Eye of Terror or other warp-touched regions, building fortresses in the Immaterium where they could operate without Imperial interference while remaining vulnerable to the warp's corrupting influence. The documentation of Alpha Legion activities by Imperial authorities remained fragmentary and contradictory, with different organizations maintaining incompatible assessments of the threat the Legion represented. The Inquisition treated the Alpha Legion as a priority threat, requiring constant vigilance and aggressive countermeasures, their records documenting thousands of suspected Alpha Legion operations across the Imperium. The Adeptus Astartes maintained different assessments, with some chapters viewing the Alpha Legion as dangerous enemies requiring extermination, while others questioned whether the fragmented cells that bore the Legion's colors still constituted a unified threat worthy of significant resource allocation. The Administratum's records reflected this confusion, with some documents treating the Alpha Legion as a major threat equivalent to other traitor legions, while others classified them as a minor concern overshadowed by more immediate dangers. The truth about the Alpha Legion's nature and objectives in the 41st millennium remained as elusive as it had been during the Heresy, hidden behind layers of deception, fragmentation, and contradictory evidence that defied coherent analysis. Each cell operated according to its own logic, pursued its own goals, and maintained its own interpretation of what it meant to be Alpha Legion. Some genuinely served chaos, others claimed to serve the Emperor, and most served only themselves and their own survival. The Legion that Alpharius and Omegon had created had become something that perhaps even its founders could not have predicted: a self-perpetuating system of cells that would continue operating indefinitely, each pursuing objectives that might align with or contradict the original mission, creating confusion and uncertainty that served no clear purpose beyond its own continuation. The Hydra had grown so many heads that no one, possibly including the Alpha Legion themselves, could count them all or predict where the next would strike. The Testra Prime deception stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of Alpha Legion operational methodology, achieving strategic victory through systematic infiltration and misdirection rather than conventional military force. Testra Prime occupied a critical position along a major warp route connecting several densely populated Imperial sectors, making it a nexus for trade, military logistics, and administrative coordination. The planet itself hosted a substantial Imperial Navy facility, multiple Adeptus Mechanicus forge complexes, and a garrison force that included elements from 3 separate Imperial Guard regiments, along with a detachment of planetary defense forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The world's defenses incorporated orbital weapon platforms, extensive ground-based anti-aircraft batteries, and a command and control network that integrated military and civilian infrastructure into a comprehensive defensive system. The Alpha Legion cell that targeted Testra Prime began their operation years before any overt military action occurred. Operatives infiltrated the planet's civilian population, establishing themselves as merchants, technical specialists, and administrative functionaries whose positions provided access to critical information about planetary defenses, supply chains, and command structures. These deep cover agents spent months and sometimes years building their cover identities, creating social connections and professional reputations that would withstand scrutiny from Imperial security services. Some operatives married into local families, established businesses that became integral to the planetary economy, and achieved positions of trust within institutions that would prove crucial during the operation's execution phase. The intelligence gathered during this extended infiltration phase revealed vulnerabilities that conventional reconnaissance could never have identified. The operatives mapped the personal relationships between key officers in the Planetary Defense Force, identifying rivalries and grudges that could be exploited to create command dysfunction. They documented the maintenance schedules for critical defensive systems, noting periods when specific installations would be operating at reduced capacity. They infiltrated the Mechanicus forge complexes, gaining access to technical specifications for the weapon systems and void shields that protected the planet's orbital facilities. This comprehensive intelligence picture allowed the Alpha Legion to design an operation that would systematically dismantle Testra Prime's defenses through precisely targeted strikes rather than requiring overwhelming military force. The operation's opening phase began with a series of industrial accidents and equipment failures that appeared unrelated to outside observers, but which systematically degraded the planet's defensive capabilities. A fire in a Promethium refinery destroyed fuel stocks that would have been needed to maintain the orbital defense platform's reactor systems. A structural collapse in one of the Mechanicus forge complexes killed several senior tech priests and destroyed manufacturing equipment used to produce replacement parts for anti-aircraft batteries. A computer virus introduced into the Planetary Defense Force's logistics network created inventory errors that resulted in critical ammunition shortages at key defensive positions. Each incident appeared to be an unfortunate accident or the result of incompetence rather than sabotage, preventing Imperial authorities from recognizing that they were under attack until the damage had already been done. The assassination of key personnel complemented these infrastructure attacks, creating leadership vacuums at critical moments. The commander of the Orbital Defense Network died in what appeared to be a ground vehicle accident, his replacement being an officer who lacked his predecessor's experience and who had been identified by Alpha Legion intelligence as prone to hesitation under pressure. A senior Mechanicus Magos responsible for maintaining the planet's void shield generators suffered a fatal malfunction in his augmetic life support systems, his death creating confusion about maintenance protocols that resulted in several shield generators being offline during the operation's crucial phases. The Imperial Guard regimental commander, who had been most vocal about improving planetary security, disappeared under circumstances that suggested desertion rather than foul play, his disappearance creating a scandal that distracted military leadership from the broader pattern of incidents affecting the planet's defenses. The psychological warfare component of the operation proved as important as the physical sabotage and assassinations. Alpha Legion operatives spread rumors about impending Xenos invasions, creating anxiety among the civilian population that manifested in panic buying and civil unrest that strained law enforcement resources. False intelligence suggesting corruption within the planetary government led to investigations that consumed administrative attention and created conflicts between military and civilian authorities. Propaganda distributed through compromised media outlets promoted distrust of imperial institutions, gradually eroding the social cohesion that effective defense required. These psychological operations created an environment where the population's morale had been significantly degraded before any overt military action occurred. When the Alpha Legion finally revealed their presence with direct military action, the planet's defenders found themselves unable to mount effective resistance. The orbital defense platforms that should have interdicted the attacking fleet had been disabled through the cumulative effects of fuel shortages, maintenance failures, and command confusion. The anti-aircraft batteries that would have contested landing zones malfunctioned due to ammunition shortages and technical problems that Alpha Legion saboteurs had created weeks earlier. The command and control network that should have coordinated defensive operations collapsed as key nodes failed and communication systems experienced interference from cyber warfare attacks. The defending forces possessed adequate numbers and equipment to resist the Alpha Legion assault, but the systematic degradation of their supporting infrastructure rendered them incapable of organizing coherent resistance. The actual combat phase of the operation lasted less than 72 hours from the Alpha Legion fleet's arrival in system to the planet's capitulation. The attacking force numbered fewer than 3 companies of Alpha Legion warriors supported by several regiments of cultist auxiliaries, a force that should have been grossly inadequate to conquer a world of Testra Prime's strategic importance and defensive strength. However, the preparatory operations had created conditions where this modest force could achieve objectives that would have required a much larger conventional assault. Alpha Legion strike teams captured key facilities that the sabotage campaign had left vulnerable, while cultist forces occupied population centers whose defenders had been demoralized by months of psychological warfare. The planetary governor surrendered when Alpha Legion operatives revealed that they had infiltrated his personal security detail and could kill him at any moment, his capitulation eliminating organized resistance before many Imperial forces had even engaged the enemy. The aftermath of Testra Prime demonstrated the strategic value of the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare. The planet's conquest provided the attacking cell with substantial material resources, including void ships, weapons stockpiles, and manufacturing facilities that enhanced their operational capabilities. More importantly, the operation's success created psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Imperial authorities across multiple sectors implemented security reviews and counterintelligence operations in response to Testra Prime's fall, consuming resources and creating bureaucratic friction that hindered military operations. The ease with which a relatively small Alpha Legion force had conquered a heavily defended world created anxiety about similar operations targeting other critical installations, leading to defensive redeployments that weakened Imperial positions elsewhere. The Alpha Legion had achieved strategic effects disproportionate to the forces actually employed, validating their emphasis on infiltration and deception over conventional military power. The infiltration of Imperial institutions represented perhaps the Alpha Legion's most disturbing capability, and the one that created the most persistent anxiety among Imperial security services. Evidence accumulated over millennia suggested that Alpha Legion operatives had successfully embedded themselves within organizations across the Imperium's administrative and military structures, creating intelligence networks that provided comprehensive awareness of Imperial activities while remaining nearly impossible to detect or eliminate. The scope of this infiltration remained uncertain, with estimates ranging from isolated agents in peripheral institutions to systematic penetration of core Imperial organizations, including those responsible for identifying and countering such infiltration. The Inquisition itself became a particular focus of concern regarding Alpha Legion infiltration. Several documented cases existed where individuals who had served as inquisitors for decades were revealed to be Alpha Legion operatives, their true allegiance discovered only when they conducted operations that exposed them, or when other intelligence sources identified their deception. The most notorious case involved an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus who had spent 40 years investigating chaos cults and prosecuting heretics before being identified as an Alpha Legion agent. This individual had built an impeccable reputation within the Inquisition, had been granted access to some of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, and had directed investigations that potentially compromised other counterintelligence operations. The discovery of this infiltration created a crisis within the Inquisition as officials attempted to determine what information had been compromised and whether other supposedly loyal inquisitors might also be Alpha Legion operatives. The methods used to achieve such deep infiltration demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Imperial institutional cultures and security protocols. Alpha Legion operatives did not simply assume false identities and hope to avoid detection. They became the individuals they pretended to be, living their cover identities so completely that they exhibited genuine belief in Imperial ideology and authentic emotional responses to events affecting the Imperium. An operative embedded within the administratum might spend decades performing bureaucratic duties with competence and dedication that earned promotions and expanded access, their true purpose remaining dormant until some future operation required activation. This level of commitment to maintaining cover made detection extraordinarily difficult, as the operatives displayed none of the behavioral indicators that typically identified infiltrators or traitors. The administratum's vast bureaucratic apparatus provided particularly fertile ground for Alpha Legion infiltration due to the organization's size and the anonymity that characterized much of its workforce. An operative embedded within the administratum could access information about Imperial military deployments, resource allocations, and strategic planning while attracting minimal scrutiny, as long as they performed their assigned administrative duties competently. The sheer scale of the administratum's operations meant that even extensive security reviews could not thoroughly investigate every functionary, creating opportunities for patient operatives to establish themselves and gradually work toward positions that provided access to increasingly valuable intelligence. Reports suggested that some Alpha Legion operatives had achieved senior positions within the administratum, giving them influence over decisions that affected entire sectors, while their true allegiance remained undetected. The possibility of Alpha Legion infiltration within other Space Marine chapters represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their intelligence operations. Several incidents documented over the millennia suggested that Alpha Legion operatives had successfully integrated themselves into Loyalist chapters, either by assuming the identities of legitimate battle brothers or by actually undergoing the implantation process and indoctrination that created Space Marines while maintaining secret loyalty to the Alpha Legion. The mechanisms by which such infiltration could be achieved remained unclear, as the gene seed implantation process and subsequent indoctrination should have created loyalty to the Emperor and the chapter that could not be subverted. However, the documented cases suggested that Alpha Legion operatives had somehow circumvented these safeguards, creating situations where supposedly loyal Space Marines actually served traitor interests. One well-documented case involved a squad of Ultramarines who participated in a campaign against an Orquois before being identified as Alpha Legion operatives through evidence that emerged years after the campaign concluded. These warriors had fought with distinction, displayed appropriate tactical competence and adherence to the Codex Astartes, and exhibited no behavioral anomalies that suggested divided loyalty. Their exposure occurred only when captured Alpha Legion documents referenced the operation these supposed Ultramarines had participated in, revealing details that could only have been known by someone present during the campaign. The investigation that followed determined that the entire squad had been Alpha Legion operatives who had somehow acquired Ultramarines' gene seed and equipment, undergone training that allowed them to perfectly mimic Ultramarines' doctrine and behavior, and maintain their deception for years while operating within Ultramarines' forces. The strategic implications of potential Space Marine chapter infiltration proved deeply troubling for Imperial military planning. If Alpha Legion operatives could successfully pose as members of Loyalist chapters, then any Space Marine force might include traitors whose presence would remain undetected until they chose to reveal themselves. This possibility created suspicion between chapters and undermined the trust that effective military cooperation required. Some chapters implemented extreme security measures in response to infiltration concerns, including genetic testing of all battle brothers and psychological screening designed to identify divided loyalties. However, these measures consumed resources and created friction within chapters, while providing no guarantee of actually identifying Alpha Legion infiltrators who had been specifically trained to defeat such countermeasures. The conflicts between the Alpha Legion and other traitor legions reflected both practical competition for resources and fundamental disagreements about objectives and methods. The word-bearers particularly despised the Alpha Legion, viewing their ambiguous relationship with chaos worship as evidence of weakness or hidden loyalty to the Emperor. Lorgar's sons had fully embraced the ruinous powers and built their entire post-heresy existence around spreading chaos corruption across the galaxy. The Alpha Legion's resistance to such complete corruption, combined with documented instances of Alpha Legion forces sabotaging word-bearers' operations, created intense animosity between the two legions. Engagements between word-bearers and Alpha Legion forces occurred with disturbing frequency, their conflicts often more vicious than battles against Loyalist forces due to the ideological dimensions that motivated both sides. The word-bearers viewed the Alpha Legion's methods as fundamentally dishonorable, a perspective that reflected their own commitment to open worship of the Chaos Gods and direct confrontation with Imperial forces. The Alpha Legion's emphasis on deception and infiltration contradicted the word-bearers' belief that chaos should be embraced openly, and that its superiority should be demonstrated through direct military victory rather than through subterfuge. This philosophical difference manifested in tactical conflicts, where word-bearers' forces attempted to destroy Alpha Legion infiltration networks and eliminate operatives they discovered within populations the word-bearers sought to convert to chaos worship. The Alpha Legion responded by sabotaging word-bearers' summoning rituals, assassinating Dark Apostles who led word-bearers' warbands, and conducting false flag operations that created conflicts between word-bearers' forces and other Chaos warbands. The Iron Warriors maintained a different but equally hostile relationship with the Alpha Legion, their conflicts driven by competition for resources and territory rather than ideological disagreement. Perdurabo's sons specialized in siege warfare and the construction of fortifications, creating permanent bases and strongholds that required substantial resources to maintain. The Alpha Legion's nomadic operational style and emphasis on mobility rather than holding territory-created situations, where Iron Warriors' investments in fortifications became vulnerable to Alpha Legion infiltration and sabotage. Several documented cases existed where Alpha Legion operatives had spent years infiltrating Iron Warriors' fortress worlds, gathering intelligence about defensive systems and garrison strengths before conducting operations that either destroyed the fortifications or seized them for Alpha Legion use. The Iron Warriors responded to these infiltrations with brutal efficiency, implementing security protocols that emphasized isolation and redundancy over trust. Iron Warriors' fortresses incorporated multiple independent defensive systems that could function even if other systems were compromised, limiting the damage that infiltrators could inflict. They employed extensive surveillance and conducted regular purges of support personnel to eliminate potential Alpha Legion agents. These measures reduced, but did not eliminate successful Alpha Legion infiltrations, as the operatives adapted their methods to account for Iron Warrior's countermeasures. The resulting competition created a cycle of infiltration and counter-infiltration that consumed both legions' resources while producing no clear strategic advantage for either side. The Night Lords viewed the Alpha Legion with contempt rather than hostility, their disdain reflecting the Night Lords' own emphasis on terror tactics and their belief that the Alpha Legion's subtle methods represented cowardice. Conrad Kerr's sons built their identity around creating fear through displays of overwhelming violence and brutality, their approach to warfare emphasizing psychological impact through overt acts rather than through the subtle manipulation that characterized Alpha Legion operations. The Night Lords considered the Alpha Legion's infiltration tactics to be dishonorable skulking that avoided the direct confrontation that true warriors should embrace. This contempt occasionally manifested in violent conflicts when Night Lords' warbands encountered Alpha Legion forces, though these engagements typically resulted in the Alpha Legion withdrawing rather than accepting the direct combat that the Night Lords preferred. The era Indomitus brought unprecedented changes to the Imperium with the opening of the Great Rift and the return of Roboute Guilliman from his 10,000-year stasis. The Alpha Legion's response to these developments revealed the diversity of objectives and allegiances that characterized different cells, while demonstrating that the Legion remained capable of coordinating significant operations when circumstances warranted such coordination. The Great Rift's creation divided the Imperium physically, creating the Dark Imperium on the far side of the Warp Storm, where Imperial forces struggled to maintain order against intensified chaos incursions. This division created both threats and opportunities for Alpha Legion cells, with some exploiting the chaos to expand their operations, while others apparently worked to mitigate the damage the Rift inflicted on Imperial defensive capabilities. Guilliman's return and his assumption of leadership over the Imperium's military forces created particular concerns for Alpha Legion cells given the Primarch's history with the Legion. The Ultramarines Primarch had supposedly killed Alpharius on Escrador, though the truth of that encounter remained disputed. Guilliman's implementation of the Primaris Space Marine program and his reforms of Imperial military doctrine created new challenges for Alpha Legion infiltration operations, as the new organizational structures and enhanced security protocols made traditional infiltration methods less effective. However, the massive scale of the Primaris rollout also created opportunities for infiltration, as the Imperium's need to rapidly integrate new warriors into existing chapters created gaps in vetting processes that Alpha Legion operatives could potentially exploit. Several documented incidents suggested coordinated Alpha Legion responses to specific threats emerging in the era Indomitus. When the Plague Wars threatened to overwhelm Ultramar, reports emerged of Alpha Legion forces conducting strikes against Death Guard logistics networks and sabotaging Nurgle cult operations in ways that aided Imperial defensive efforts. These interventions could not be attributed to simple opportunism, as they appeared timed to provide maximum benefit to Guilliman's forces at critical moments. Similarly, during major Tyranid incursions in the Galactic East, Alpha Legion cells provided intelligence about Hive fleet movements to Imperial forces through anonymous channels, information that proved accurate and allowed defenders to prepare more effective resistance. These actions suggested that some Alpha Legion elements viewed the existential threats facing humanity as requiring cooperation with Imperial forces despite the Legion's traitor status. The Indomitus Crusade itself became a target for Alpha Legion operations, though whether these operations sought to hinder or help the Crusade remained unclear. Guilliman's massive military expedition to reclaim worlds lost during the Age of Strife faced sabotage that bore Alpha Legion hallmarks, including infiltration of Crusade logistics networks and assassination of key officers. However, the Crusade also received intelligence from anonymous sources that proved crucial for several successful campaigns. intelligence that Imperial analysts attributed to Alpha Legion sources based on its specificity and accuracy. This pattern of simultaneous hindrance and assistance characterized the Alpha Legion's broader response to the era Indomitus, creating the same confusion about their objectives that had defined the Legion throughout its history. The question of the Alpha Legion's true allegiance has tormented Imperial strategists, inquisitors, and military commanders for 10 millennia without resolution. Every attempt to definitively categorize the Legion as traitors serving chaos, secret loyalists working toward the Emperor's ultimate goals, or something entirely outside these binary classifications, has foundered on contradictory evidence that refuses to cohere into a single narrative. The Legion's actions across 10,000 years include atrocities that mark them as enemies of humanity, alongside interventions that have preserved Imperial worlds from destruction. They have summoned demons and slaughtered chaos cultists, infiltrated loyalist Space Marine chapters, and sabotaged traitor Legion operations, served the ruinous powers, and apparently resisted corruption that consumed other traitor legions. This pattern of contradictions suggests not confusion or inconsistency, but rather a deliberate strategy of maintaining ambiguity as an operational asset more valuable than any clear allegiance could provide. The possibility that different Alpha Legion cells pursue fundamentally incompatible objectives complicates any assessment of the Legion's collective allegiance. A cell that has fully embraced chaos worship and conducts operations designed to spread corruption bears little resemblance to another cell that claims continued loyalty to the Emperor and sabotages traitor Legion campaigns. These cells share genetic heritage, tactical doctrines, and organizational structures, but they serve different masters and pursue different visions of what the Alpha Legion should be. The fragmentation that occurred during the Scouring transformed a unified military force into a constellation of independent warbands, whose only common feature is their shared origin in the 20th Legion. Asking whether the Alpha Legion serves chaos or the Emperor becomes meaningless when different components of the Legion serve both, neither, or something else, entirely depending on their commander's interpretations of the Legion's purpose. The Cabal's prophecy and the choice it presented to Alpharius and Omegon continues to cast shadows across any analysis of the Legion's allegiance. If the twins genuinely believed the Cabal's vision that Horus's rapid victory represented humanity's only path to ultimate survival, then their betrayal during the heresy represented the highest form of loyalty rather than treachery. This interpretation transforms every subsequent Alpha Legion action into a potential element of a strategy spanning millennia, each operation potentially serving objectives that cannot be understood without knowledge of the broader plan. However, the Cabal's prophecy has not manifested as predicted. Horus did not achieve rapid victory, chaos did not consume itself through internal conflict, and humanity endures in the 41st millennium despite 10,000 years of stagnation and warfare. The failure of the prophecy raises questions about whether the Alpha Legion continues pursuing objectives based on a vision that events have proven false, or whether they adapted their strategy when the prophecy's timeline collapsed. The possibility that some Alpha Legion elements recognize the Cabal's vision as flawed or deliberately deceptive adds another layer to the mystery of their allegiance. Perhaps different cells reached different conclusions about the prophecy's validity, with some continuing to work toward chaos's self-destruction, while others abandoned that goal as unachievable or undesirable. The documented instances of Alpha Legion forces fighting each other might reflect not just competition for resources, but fundamental disagreements about whether the Cabal's vision should still guide Legion operations. A cell that believes chaos must be allowed to triumph temporarily might view another cell's resistance to chaos corruption as betrayal of the Legion's original mission, while that second cell might consider the first's embrace of chaos as evidence they have lost sight of their true purpose. These internal conflicts would remain invisible to outside observers who lack context for understanding what actually motivates the combatants. The impact of the Alpha Legion on Imperial paranoia extends far beyond the actual damage their operations inflict. The knowledge that Alpha Legion operatives might be embedded within any Imperial institution, that any individual might secretly serve the 20th Legion, creates an atmosphere of suspicion that corrodes the trust necessary for effective governance and military operations. Inquisitors investigating potential Alpha Legion infiltration must consider the possibility that their own staff includes operatives, that the intelligence they receive has been deliberately crafted to mislead them, and that their investigative efforts might actually serve Alpha Legion objectives by creating exactly the kind of institutional paralysis that benefits an enemy who operates through deception. This paranoia becomes self-reinforcing, as aggressive counterintelligence measures create resentment and resistance that can be exploited by actual Alpha Legion agents, while also generating false positives that waste resources investigating loyal Imperial servants. The difficulties the Alpha Legion creates for Imperial intelligence services stem from their systematic inversion of normal intelligence operations. Most enemies of the Imperium can be understood through analysis of their capabilities, objectives, and patterns of behavior. Intelligence services collect information about enemy force dispositions, identify command structures, and predict future actions based on observed patterns. The Alpha Legion defeats these analytical approaches by maintaining no consistent patterns, by operating through cellular structures that prevent comprehensive intelligence about their overall capabilities, and by conducting operations whose objectives remain unclear even after their completion. An Imperial intelligence analyst attempting to understand Alpha Legion intentions faces an impossible task, as the information available suggests multiple contradictory interpretations and provides no reliable method for determining which interpretation accurately reflects reality. The Alpha Legion's practice of feeding false intelligence through compromised sources creates additional problems for Imperial intelligence services. An analyst who receives information about Alpha Legion activities must consider whether that information represents genuine intelligence, deliberate disinformation designed to mislead Imperial forces, or accurate intelligence that the Alpha Legion has allowed to be discovered because acting on it will serve their purposes. This uncertainty paralyzes decision-making, as commanders cannot confidently act on intelligence that might lead their forces into traps or might represent genuine opportunities that will be lost if not exploited. The Alpha Legion benefits from this paralysis regardless of whether any specific piece of intelligence is accurate, as the mere possibility of deception creates hesitation that degrades Imperial military effectiveness. The question of Omegon's current status and whether one or both Primarch twins still live represents one of the great mysteries of the 41st millennium. The contradictory accounts of Alpharius's death at Pluto or Escrador, combined with the Alpha Legion's practice of multiple warriors claiming the Alpharius identity, make it impossible to determine with certainty whether either twin actually died during those engagements. The continued appearance of warriors claiming to be Alpharius in the millennia, since the heresy could represent Omegon maintaining both identities, a surviving Alpharius continuing to operate under his own name, or simply Alpha Legion operatives perpetuating the deception that their Primarch lives. Each possibility has different implications for understanding the Legion's current operations and objectives, but no evidence exists that definitively supports one interpretation over the others. Reports from various sources across the Imperium describe encounters with individuals who claim to be Alpharius, or who display capabilities suggesting Primarch-level abilities. These encounters occur with disturbing frequency, given that both twins should theoretically be dead, suggesting either that at least one survived, or that the Alpha Legion has developed methods for creating warriors whose capabilities approach Primarch levels. Some accounts describe an Alpharius who appears unchanged from the heresy era, a Primarch who has somehow avoided the physical degradation and mutation that affects most Chaos Space Marines over millennia. Other reports present an Alpharius who bears visible signs of age or corruption, suggesting either genuine Primarch survival with accumulated damage or an elaborate impersonation by a heavily modified legionary. The contradictions between these accounts make it impossible to determine whether they describe the same individual, multiple individuals claiming the same identity, or entirely fabricated encounters designed to create confusion. The possibility that Omegon survived while Alpharius died, or vice versa, creates scenarios where the surviving twin continues operating under both identities to maintain the fiction that neither has been lost. This approach would be entirely consistent with the Alpha Legion's established practices and would provide operational advantages by preventing enemies from knowing that one Primarch had been eliminated. A surviving twin could appear as both Alpharius and Omegon in different contexts, maintaining the appearance of dual leadership while actually operating alone. The psychological impact of this deception would extend beyond simple confusion about the Primarch's status, as it would demonstrate that even the death of a Primarch cannot definitively eliminate Alpha Legion command capability. The Legion's enemies would face the disturbing reality that killing one Primarch accomplishes nothing if the other continues using both identities. The alternative possibility that both twins died during the heresy or its immediate aftermath, and that the Alpha Legion has simply continued claiming their Primarchs live, raises different questions about the Legion's nature and organizational resilience. If the Legion can function effectively for 10 millennia without actual Primarch leadership, maintaining operational effectiveness, and continuing to conduct sophisticated intelligence operations, then it represents something fundamentally different from other Space Marine legions. The other traitor legions that lost their Primarchs suffered significant degradation in capability and cohesion, fragmenting into warbands that bear little resemblance to their original unified forces. The Alpha Legion's apparent resistance to this degradation suggests either that their organizational structure was designed to function independently of Primarch leadership from the beginning, or that some form of leadership exists that provides continuity even if it does not involve the actual Primarch twins. Theories about hidden Alpha Legion leadership structures that operate behind the public-facing claims of Primarch survival have gained traction among Imperial intelligence analysts, attempting to understand how the Legion maintains its capabilities. These theories suggest that a council of senior commanders, or a single individual who has assumed effective command, directs Legion operations while maintaining the fiction of Primarch leadership to preserve morale and operational security. This hidden leadership would possess comprehensive knowledge of Legion assets and operations, while remaining unknown to Imperial intelligence services, making them impossible to target or eliminate. The cellular structure that characterizes Alpha Legion organization would facilitate this kind of hidden leadership, as individual cells would not need to know who actually directed their operations, as long as they received coherent strategic guidance through established communication channels. The philosophical implications of the Alpha Legion's existence force confrontation with uncomfortable questions about the nature of loyalty, treachery, and the moral calculus of achieving objectives through deception. The Cabal presented the twins with a choice that framed betrayal as the path to ultimate loyalty, arguing that serving the Emperor's vision required working against the Emperor himself. This framing challenges fundamental assumptions about duty and allegiance that structure Imperial ideology and military culture. If the Alpha Legion genuinely believed that enabling humanity's near extinction represented the only path to ultimate survival, can their actions be classified as treachery, or should they be understood as a form of loyalty that transcends conventional moral categories? The question has no comfortable answer, as accepting the legitimacy of the Alpha Legion's reasoning undermines the moral clarity that the Imperium requires to maintain cohesion, while rejecting it requires dismissing the possibility that unconventional methods might be necessary to achieve objectives that conventional approaches cannot address. The concept of treachery in service of a greater good becomes particularly problematic when the greater good itself remains unclear or contested. The Alpha Legion's actions, since the heresy, suggest no coherent vision of what they seek to achieve, with different cells pursuing objectives that range from spreading chaos corruption to protecting Imperial worlds from existential threats. If the Legion has no unified objective, if different elements pursue contradictory goals based on their commanders' individual interpretations of the Legion's purpose, then the philosophical question of whether their treachery serves a greater good becomes unanswerable. Treachery that serves no coherent purpose beyond its own perpetuation cannot be justified through appeals to ultimate objectives, as those objectives do not exist in any meaningful sense. The Alpha Legion might have begun as an instrument designed to achieve a specific strategic goal, but 10 millennia of fragmentation and divergence have transformed it into something that serves only its own continued existence. The debate about whether ends justify means takes on particular urgency when considering Alpha Legion operations that have inflicted massive casualties while claiming to serve humanity's ultimate interests. If a cell conducts an operation that results in millions of deaths, but claims those deaths were necessary to prevent some greater catastrophe, how can outside observers evaluate that claim without knowledge of what catastrophe was supposedly prevented? The Alpha Legion's emphasis on operational security and compartmentalization means that the strategic reasoning behind their operations remains hidden, making it impossible to assess whether specific actions actually served legitimate purposes or simply caused suffering without meaningful benefit. This opacity prevents moral evaluation of Alpha Legion conduct, as judgment requires understanding objectives and consequences that the Legion deliberately conceals. The possibility that much Alpha Legion activity serves no strategic purpose beyond maintaining the appearance of purposeful action represents perhaps the most disturbing interpretation of their 10,000-year history. Organizations can develop self-perpetuating dynamics where continued operation becomes an end in itself, where the original mission that justified the organization's creation becomes secondary to the organization's survival and expansion. The Alpha Legion might have reached this state centuries or millennia ago, with individual cells conducting operations, because that is what Alpha Legion cells do rather than because those operations serve any coherent strategic vision. The sophistication and effectiveness that characterize Alpha Legion operations would persist even if they served no broader purpose, as the tactical excellence and operational security that define the Legion's methods do not require strategic coherence to function at the operational level. The enduring mystery of the Alpha Legion's true nature and objectives creates a situation where every interpretation remains plausible and none can be confirmed. They might be traitors who fully embraced chaos and conduct operations designed to spread corruption and undermine the Imperium. They might be secret loyalists who work outside Imperial command structures to protect humanity from threats that conventional forces cannot address. They might be fragments of a shattered legion pursuing divergent objectives based on their commanders' individual interpretations of ancient orders. They might be an organization that has lost sight of its original purpose and continues operating through institutional momentum rather than strategic vision. The evidence accumulated over 10 millennia supports all these interpretations while definitively confirming none, creating an enigma that may be fundamentally unsolvable because the Alpha Legion itself might not possess a unified answer to questions about its nature and allegiance. The Alpha Legion's legacy extends beyond their direct military impact to encompass the uncertainty they have injected into Imperial strategic thinking and the paranoia they have created within Imperial institutions. Every Space Marine chapter must consider the possibility that Alpha Legion operatives have infiltrated their ranks. Every Imperial Guard regiment faces the knowledge that their ranks might include Alpha Legion agents. Every Inquisitor investigating heresy must account for the possibility that the Alpha Legion has manipulated the evidence they examine. This pervasive uncertainty represents perhaps the Legion's greatest achievement, as it creates an environment where the mere possibility of Alpha Legion involvement degrades effectiveness and creates paralysis regardless of whether the Legion actually operates in specific contexts. The Hydra has grown so many heads, real and imagined, that the Imperium cannot track them all and cannot distinguish genuine threats from phantoms created by its own paranoia. The 41st millennium finds the Alpha Legion as it has existed for 10,000 years, fragmented, contradictory, and fundamentally unknowable. Individual cells continue conducting operations whose purposes remain opaque, serving objectives that might align with imperial interests, chaos goals, or purely personal agendas, depending on their commander's convictions. Warriors claiming to be Alpharius appear in scattered reports across the galaxy, their claims neither confirmed nor refuted by evidence that would satisfy skeptics. The question of whether the Legion serves chaos, the Emperor, or something else entirely remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The Alpha Legion endures as it began, as an enigma wrapped in deception, an organization whose true nature and purpose may never be understood by those outside its innermost circles, if such understanding exists even within the Legion itself. The Hydra's heads continue to strike from the shadows, and whether those strikes serve humanity's ultimate survival or its gradual destruction remains the Alpha Legion's most closely guarded secret.